Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with Joshua Sijuwade, very good friend of the channel. I've had him on before to talk about transubstantiation. I think the last video I did with you was with Khalil Andani about
Oh
the
yes,
Trinity and Islamic
yeah.
Neoplatonism. So, I
Thank
mean,
you.
that was epic. And Joshua, I love having you on.
Thank you.
So, before we get into the discussion today on your book, Analytic Theism, Joshua, how have you been?
Yeah, I've been very well. My children have been keeping me busy. So outside of sort of writing, it's just sort of good family life at the moment. And yeah, I've been doing well.
That's very good to hear. And I just want to plug really quick that, Joshua, you gave me a copy of your book, and I'm very thankful because, it's like Rutledge, so it's going to be a bit more expensive. Can't wait for like the paperback, right? That more people can
Yeah,
probably access it then.
yes, yeah.
And Joshua, you gave me your book, and you wrote a very nice little letter to me, and so I appreciate that very much.
Thank
Yeah, I
you.
hold this very dearly to my heart, Joshua.
Thank
And
you.
I will admit that I haven't had time to read the whole thing, right? I think it's like this is your
Yeah.
tone. I mean, Joshua, this you could end your career right here and say this is your magnum opus, right?
Yeah. I mean, definitely for the size wise,
Uh-huh.
hopefully for the quality as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And from just like reading it, just the little bits and pieces that I've done, I can just tell that you put in so much work to this. And so this was a real work of love, and I can tell that it's a very serious work of scholarship.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that as well. Thank you.
So the format for today's episode is Joshua will give his presentation, kind of going through the summary, I think, of his book, and not every jot and tittle, not every little piece. Obviously, if you want the whole thing, go to the book or talk to Joshua. And after that, I might ask a few questions. If I have any, I'll be taking notes. And for all of you in the live chat, please ask your questions. And I'll try to keep track as Joshua's talking to, marking your questions as we go along. So once again, presentation, my questions, your questions, and then that'll load. So, Joshua, let me put your presentation on the screen and we are good to go.
Yeah, great. No, thank you very much. So, yeah, I'm going to just walk through the book as such. It's a very, as Swan was saying, it's quite a large book, so over 600 pages. So this is sort of to make it as accessible, the content, to people as possible. Because a lot of people, you just won't find the time really to go through a 600-page book, especially of philosophy. So hopefully this sort of presentation will provide an overview of what people can expect the argument is in the specific book. So yeah, so I named the work Analytic Theism, and my whole focus was on performing a philosophical investigation, specifically of the question, is theism true? So when you have the sort of, you're arguing with atheists, or you're speaking in a philosophical sense about the existence of God, we use the term theism because theism is sort of the technical term which sort of captures the claim that there is a God. And so I was trying to perform a specific investigation to see, do we have good reason to actually believe that there is a God? And my main focus was on not sort of rehashing the terrain that's been sort of, I would say, well trodden by a lot of philosophers over a long period of time, maybe stemming from Aquinas and onwards, where people look at the cosmological argument and teleological arguments and other types of arguments. But I was actually saying, and in sort of prior to writing this, I was saying that actually maybe it's good if we have a different focus in our natural theology. So natural theology is just when you are trying to reason to the existence of God and his nature from natural phenomena. And so I was thinking that actually maybe there's a different area that we can focus in to sort of provide evidence for the existence of God. And so because I was sort of writing in metaphysics related to things like the Trinity, the incarnation, I had a lot of time to sort of get my feet wet in metaphysical sort of discussions. And sort of I realized that there was sort of a reservoir of data which was untapped by, I would say, philosophers of religion, so people who are looking at these questions about the existence of God. And I sort of thought to myself that there does seem to be good reasons, just not even based upon cosmological data and teleological data, but actually metaphysical data to believe in God. And so my main focus in this presentation and in the book as a whole is to provide you with sort of the mechanism and the methodology and sort of the argumentation that I laid out in the book to sort of reason to the existence of God from metaphysics. And so the good place to sort of start would be with the methodology that I utilize. Because when you're doing natural theology, when you're doing philosophy of religion, there's various ways you can sort of argue. You can utilize things like deductive reasoning, and that would be where the conclusion of an argument is certain because it's entailed by the premises. And so you'll have a lot of people who are working in philosophy of religion who put forward sort of deductive argumentation for the existence of God. And then you have other people who sort of use inductive reasoning, where you're sort of looking at probabilistic data, and you'll see a lot of sort of numbers and utilizing sort of theorems such as Bayes' theorem to sort of argue for the existence of God. And this is very evident in the work of Richard Swinburne. But I decided to utilize a different methodology called abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning is specifically an a posteriori approach. So I'm not sort of arguing from an a priori standpoint of saying, let's say, for example, we have the definition of God, and based upon the definition of God, we can then sort of reason to him existing. That would be an ontological argument, and that ontological argument is a priori because it's independent of experience. But what I'm sort of arguing for with the abductive methodology is an a posteriori approach, where I'll be saying, actually, there is data that we can study within metaphysics from an empirical standpoint, and based upon that, we can then reason to the existence of God utilizing abductive reasoning. Now, with the specific methodology, because I was looking at metaphysics instead of science, I needed to sort of take a few steps back and say, well, when we're trying to explain certain data, because when you're doing abductive reasoning, you're trying to infer the best explanation of the data. So instead of trying to deduce the conclusion from the premises with deductive reasoning, or arguing probabilistically with inductive reasoning, with abductive reasoning, you're trying to infer the best explanation of the data. And so when I was trying to think through how do I go about doing that, the first step was trying to understand what does it mean to give an explanation for certain data. And a lot of the time when people are doing philosophy of religion or natural theology, they end up missing out on this question because it's very important that you actually try and understand what's the nature of an explanation, what's a good explanation for certain data. And so Richard Swinburne, for example, in his work, The Existence of God, he's one of the philosophers of religion who actually spent time looking at the nature of explanation. And sort of following suit, I thought it was important to do that in the work as well. But the way that I did it was looking at the general field of forms of explanation and trying to say, what is the best form of explanation to utilize when I'm trying to formulate arguments for the existence of God. And when you look at sort of the field when it comes to explanatory methodologies, there are sort of three main methodologies that people utilize. You have something called the deductive nomenological model, you have the unificationist account, and you have something called the pragmatic account. Now, because I don't want to go too deep into the weeds, I'm not going to unpack the other two, because the one that I actually focused on was the pragmatic account. Now, in the pragmatic account, what you are doing is that you're trying to answer a why question. So an explanation is just an answer to a question. So whenever I'm trying to give an explanation for certain data, that data or the phenomena that I'm looking at is eliciting a certain question, and the explanation that I give is then going to answer that question. Now, within a scientific context, this will be something called a why question. Why is it the case that this phenomena occurred in the way that it did? So why is it the case that such and such occurred? That will be a pragmatic explanation within a scientific in a scientific context. But then when we're looking at metaphysics has a specific pragmatic account. And this was put forward by Naomi Thompson, where she took the work of the pragmatists in the scientific literature and applied it to metaphysics. And she was saying, instead of asking a why question of why is it the case that such and such, a metaphysical pragmatic explanation will be what makes it the case that such and such exists or has the nature that it has. So instead of asking a why question, you're asking a what makes it the case that question. So what makes it the case that singleton Socrates exists? So that's a very sort of famous example in metaphysics where you look at Socrates and you look at his singleton set. And a question could be, for example, what makes it the case that singleton Socrates exists? And then the answer would be the existence of Socrates. And so the key thing here is that you're answering a certain type of question, and an explanation is an answer to a question. What makes it the case that type of question? There's three other things that are important in the pragmatic account. You have the topic of the question. So the topic of the question is a specific phenomena that you're investigating, and that will be tied to the question. You then have a contrast class, because when you're trying to answer the question, what makes it the case that something exists, you are going to have different answers that you put forward. And so there's a contrast class that will also need to be investigated for their veracity. And then you also have something called the relevance relation, which is just the idea that any explanation that you give needs to be relevant to the certain data. So what makes it the case that Socrates exists? It would not be relevant to me, say, because my shoes are blue or my shoes are green. That wouldn't answer the question. That wouldn't be a relevant answer. So it wouldn't be a relevant metaphysical explanation. So the key things for the pragmatic account is the type of question, what makes it the case, and that you are looking at a specific topic. You have a contrast class, and the answers or the explanations need to be relevant to the topic. Okay, so now looking outside of the sort of area of explanatory forms, now looking more deeply into the exact methodology that I'm utilizing, I decided when I was trying to formulate this argument for God, this abductive argument for God, that I'd like to utilize the very famous sort of methodology called inference to the best explanation. Now, a lot of people use this outside of philosophy. So this will be in the scientific realm, in the historical realm. So you're inferring the best explanation of the data. So it's called IBE. So it's quite a famous methodology that probably your audience will know. But the specific one that I was very interested in was one put forward by a guy called Peter Lipton. So he was a philosopher of science. And he was saying that inference to the best explanation needs to be understood as inference to the loveliest explanation. So we are looking for the loveliest explanation of the data. So when we are trying to infer a certain explanation of the specific data that we're looking at, we are going to be not looking for the likeliest explanation, because it's difficult to actually establish that. What you're going to look at is the loveliest explanation of data. That's the one that generates the most understanding of the data. So we understand the data better by the explanation that we put forward, and that will be the loveliest explanation of the data. So it's inference to the best explanation, but the specific form that I'm focusing on, put forward by Peter Lipton, again, very influential account, is inference to the loveliest explanation of the data. And so then, the way that this sort of goes, and I'm going to unpack this in a bit, a little bit later as well, is that there are two stages that IBE sort of operates through or operates under. So stage one of the investigation would be where you generate all of the explanatory candidates that are relevant as such to the data. So all the logically compatible explanations of the data, you generate them, and those will be the first pool of explanations that you have in front of you. But then the thing about this is that many crazy different types of explanations that just don't seem very plausible are logically compatible with the data. And so things which seem very silly, you still have to generate them because they're logically compatible with the data. So in stage one, you generate all the sort of logically possible candidates, so the ones that are compatible with the data. And then what you do is that you then filter out the ones which are implausible. And so you only then allow, and so you have a second pool called pool B. So you allow the plausible, logically compatible explanations of the data to then move into pool B, and they'll be filtered out by an epistemic filter. And so then when you get to stage two, you then perform a further analysis where you're going to select the best explanation of the data. And this is going to be through utilizing certain theoretical virtues. And I'm going to go on to that in a second, just unpacking that more. But before I do that, I just want to highlight something that's very important, because one objection that someone could say is, okay, this all sounds very interesting, but is this really data? Because I'm using the term data a lot of the time. And a lot of people will be like, only data that you can have, or the only evidence or evidential data that you can put forward for any proposition is something which is scientific. And so they will narrow the understanding of data to only the scientific realm. But I'm trying to say that there is metaphysical data for the existence of God that hasn't been analyzed up until this moment. And so the specific account of data that I'm utilizing is something called the epistemic theory of data. So this just is, so the definition of this is this theory, and it's a little bit more complex. So it's put forward by people like Schaffer Landau, who, very famous ethicist, but also he's worked on this as well. So a specific datum is a proposition or collection of propositions that individuals have reasons to believe on the onset of inquiry. So something is data if you just have good reason to believe it in the onset of your inquiry. So not everything can be classed as data, because there might be just some crazy things that people put forward. But if there is, let's say, a expert community, and the expert community believe that the propositions that the person's putting forward, there is good reasons to believe it, so good reasons are in favor of it. Doesn't mean it has to be conclusive, because you're still investigating the data, but you have good reasons to believe it, then you can put it forward as data that needs to be explained. And so what I did was I took that specific definition, and this is why the book was so, people might say, laborious when you're reading it, is because I had to, in every single data that I put forward, I had to go and put forward the reasons why philosophers have taken this on board as data. And so I had to sort of go through every time showing the reasons why in support of this specific data. And so just to make sure that everything I'm putting forward, as we'll see later, favors theism, but it is something which is taken by metaphysicians to have reasons in support of it. And so we can then, at the onset of our inquiry, take it on as data. And so the specific metaphysical data that I look at then in my investigation are two things. The first one is the existence of non-fundamental reality. So that's the first data. There appears to be non-fundamental entities that exist within reality. And then the second one, which was sort of the larger part of the book, was that I believe that there are 6 elementary features of non-fundamental reality. So there are two things here. Firstly, it is the existence of non-fundamental reality that I look at. And then the second thing is the features of non-fundamental reality. And this is good in a way in that it sort of overlaps with what people do in natural theology when it comes to sort of, let's say, the physical data, not metaphysical, but the physical data like cosmological, teleological. Because what they normally do is, like Swinburne and others, is that they will look at the existence of the universe, and then they would say that we then need to look at the features of the universe. And this is very similar. I'm saying the existence of non-fundamental reality, and then there are certain features of non-fundamental reality which are best explained by God. And so the metaphysical question that I'm trying to answer throughout this whole thing is what makes it the case that non-fundamental entities exist and have the 6 elementary features that they have. So what makes it the case that these non-fundamental entities exist, and what makes it the case that they have the certain features that I'm going to say that they have? Okay, so the plan of action then, just sort of, this is the time to sort of unpack IB a little bit more, so people can just make sure that they understand what the methodology looks like. So in stage 1, specifically in metaphysical context, I'm going to generate certain metaphysical explanatory candidates that fit with the data that I'm looking at. So if you remember again, the data that I'm looking at is the existence of non-fundamental reality and the features that it has. And so in order to take that as my data, I will then have to generate all the logically compatible options with that data, that there are non-fundamental entities within reality. And then, so what I do is I generate this, but then I will need to filter out, because there'll be very many different types of explanations of this data, which just don't seem to be plausible by working metaphysicians. And so I'll utilize a certain epistemic filter to filter through the logically compatible options. So the logically compatible potential explanations are in pool A. I then filter them through this epistemic filter based upon theoretical virtues, and then these move on to pool B. Now, after I've done that, or actually before I go to that, it'll be good to just unpack something a little bit more. So we'll move on to stage 2 in a second. But just to understand what the filter looks like and how the analysis will go about, it's very important to understand something called theoretical virtues. So when I'm in stage 1 and when I'm in stage 2, I'm going to be utilizing certain virtues to allow me to understand what's the best explanation of the data. And if you remember, the specific version of IB that I'm utilizing is inference to the loveliest explanation. Now, in Peter Lipton's work, he believed that a lovely explanation is the most virtuous one, the one that has the most virtues. Now, Lipton himself didn't actually really unpack what these virtues are. But there is certain work that's been done recently to sort of systematize the various theoretical virtues. So what I did is I utilized Lipton's sort of IB theory, but then I brought it together with sort of the work that's been done in contemporary philosophy on the theoretical virtues. Now, this systematization of the theoretical virtues allows us to identify that there are 4 virtue classes that an explanation should exhibit. So the first one is the evidential virtues. So a lovely explanation is going to be one that has the evidential virtues. So the first one is called evidential accuracy. The second one is called causal adequacy. And the third one is called explanatory depth. Now, I'm not going to really go into depth with all these ones, but with the evidential virtues, the key thing that you're looking at is, does the explanation fit with the data? So is it evidentially accurate? It fits with the data. Does it provide us with a causal mechanism for the data? And does it provide us with an explanation that's deep in a way? It's not a superficial explanation of the data. And then we have the coherential virtues. And these are the virtues which look internally at the theory itself. So a lovely explanation will be one that, again, exhibits the coherential virtues, which will include internal consistency. So is the theory, the explanation, internally consistent? Does the components work well together? Is it internally coherent? Is there sort of a harmonious whole that the explanation forms, or are there loads of ad hoc elements? And then something called universal coherence is the idea, does the theory or explanation fits with other explanations within the field? Then the aesthetic virtues, which again is looking at sort of an internal assessment of the theory, would be looking at virtues of beauty, simplicity, and unification. So a lovely explanation is one that's beautiful. That means it has an aesthetic appeal that it elicits. It's simple. It uses the fewest assumptions and entities to explain the phenomena. And it's unifying, so it exemplifies unification in that it integrates a wide range of phenomena under a single explanatory framework. So the key thing here that we're sort of looking at is, are these virtues things which are had by the explanations that we're trying to put forward? If they are, then we can take those, or let's say one explanation, to be the loveliest explanation of the data. So I'm doing this sort of virtue theoretic analysis of the explanations to see if they actually exhibit these virtues. And the explanation that exhibits these virtues the most would be the one that we infer at the end of stage 2. So just sort of returning back to the stages. So in stage 1, I use the virtues to allow me to filter through the logically compatible options. So the simplest one, the one that's most unifying, the one that's most coherent, that will be filtered through into pool B. And then stage 2 is where I select the specific best explanation. So what I now call this, when I do stage 2 analysis, and again, in a lot of people's minds, this might be a little bit challenging, but you just hopefully you're sticking with me. And when we get through into actually doing the work, because now this is sort of painting the picture, it will make a lot more sense. But with stage 2, which is sort of the key stage that we're trying to focus in, is where we select the specific theory that we're going to put forward as the best explanation of the data. And what I call at this stage is that you perform 2 forms of an assessment. You perform an internal assessment and you perform an external assessment. And internal assessments looks at all of the internal virtues of the theory. So what I've looked at already with coherence, simplicity, unification, does it have these virtues? Then it's an internally lovely theory. An external assessment is where we're going to look at the evidential virtues. So what I'm sort of doing is I'm putting the virtues that we looked at into sort of 2 forms of assessment, internal and external assessment. So the internal assessment looks at the theory itself. Is it simple? Is it unifying? Is it coherent? And then the external assessment looks at, is it evidentially accurate, causally adequate, and explanatory deep with the data that we're looking at. And so if it has these, if it fits with, or sorry, it passes these 2 forms of assessment, then it will be the loveliest explanation of the data. That's the one we will then select. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to identify the loveliest explanation, that is the most explanatory, virtuous explanation, metaphysical explanation. And the way that I define a lovely explanation, so this is the one sort of to remember what a lovely explanation is. A lovely explanation must be coherent, minimize theoretical commitments, maximize explanatory power, and unify all theoretical postulations. So the key thing here is a lovely explanation will be one that's coherent, one that minimizes theoretical commitments, so that means it's simple, one that maximizes explanatory power, that means it's evidentially accurate, causally adequate, explanatorily deep, and then it unifies all theoretical postulations. That will be the loveliest explanation of the data that we then select. Okay, so okay, I think I will skip over something quickly. Yeah, I'll skip over the first part and we'll just sort of start with the stage one. So with stage one, we've looked at what stage one is, and stage one is putting forward our specific explanation, and we are then trying to generate the logically compatible explanations with the data. Now, the specific phenomena that we're looking at stage one is reality appears to contain non-fundamental entities. So that is the first bit of data that we're looking at. There are non-fundamental entities within reality. Now, by the way, what I mean by something being non-fundamental is that it's dependent. So for example, the glass I have on my table here, sorry, I'm putting it in the wrong place. The glass I have on my table here, that's a dependent entity because it's dependent upon things for it to exist. I am a dependent entity, so are the things around me and the things around you. And so we are all non-fundamental. So it's quite evident to our senses that there are non-fundamental entities within reality. Now, given that they are sort of non-fundamental entities within reality, we're then trying to generate what's the best explanation of these non-fundamental entities. Now, if you can see at the bottom of the PowerPoint, there are 4 explanatory frameworks which fit with the data that we're looking at, that there are non-fundamental entities within reality. So we have something called metaphysical foundationalism. You have something called metaphysical infinitism, something called metaphysical coherentism, and something called metaphysical flat worldism. So there are 4 main explanatory frameworks which philosophers will put forward to say, these are the reasons why there are non-fundamental entities. And so I'm going to go through each one to help you just understand it. And I'm going to, instead of going through the details of this now, we'll just move on to the next. Okay. Actually, yeah, let me just say what foundationalism is, and then I'll go into the other ones. So foundationalism, so we're not going to spend time looking at analysis of it, but this is the one I want to defend. Foundationalism is the specific theory that there are non-fundamental entities that exist because there are fundamental entities that exist within reality. So why there are cups and tables and chairs and humans is because at the bottom level of reality, there are fundamental entities within reality. And so metaphysical foundationalism, sort of, emphasizing on the word foundationalism, is saying that there is a foundation to reality, that there are fundamental entities, or at least one fundamental entity, that ultimately grounds all the other non-fundamental entities that exist within reality. Okay, so that's the view that I'm defending. And the way that I sort of defend it at this stage is by putting the other theories through the analysis. Because what people will notice is that metaphysical foundationalism is actually the default position within metaphysics. And so why we then should, I would argue for later, take it on as the best explanation to move on to pool B is because the other ones seem to need to be filtered out. So just looking at the second option, which is called metaphysical flat worldism. So it's a bit of a weird name. But it's a theory that all entities are fundamental and there are no non-fundamental entities that exist. So it's a bit strange to put this forward as a theory. But there is a theory that there are very few defenders of this in metaphysical spheres. But the key idea here is metaphysical flat worldism sees everything at a sort of a single level. So there is no sort of built structure to reality. So as flat worldism sort of builds up a skyscraper or views the world as a skyscraper, where you have fundamental entities at the bottom and you have all the built or non-fundamental entities that are above it, metaphysical flat worldism says that there is just one single layer. There is no sort of skyscraper here. Now, why this is a bit of a strange one is because we're trying to put this forward as an explanation for why there are any non-fundamental entities within reality. And so what someone would need to do is that you'll need to explain why you take there to be no non-fundamental entities, and everything is fundamental, but you're trying to explain why we have these appearances. So what metaphysical flat worldists would say is that they will defend the position that it appears to be the case that there are non-fundamental entities that exist within reality. There's only appearances. Now, the challenges that you have with this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, is just that it doesn't seem to fit with the theoretical virtues that we want to look at. So it doesn't seem to be evidentially accurate with the phenomena that we're looking at, because it seems to conflict with the appearances. Because what you're saying is that everything at the real level is fundamental, but we're sort of we're in a delusion to believe that there are all these non-fundamental entities. So this cup that's here is a fundamental entity. It's not relying upon anything for its existence, but it appears to be like that. And that seems to not be something which you can take at face value, that all of these things are appearances. So it seems to lack that evidential accuracy with that data that we have. And then it also doesn't allow us to make sense of the words that we use, because all the words we use, for example, are non-fundamental, because all the sentences I construct, they are built by other sentences. So a word, for example, is built by letters being put together in a grammatically well-ordered fashion. And again, that would be a building, or let's say a foundationalist structure. We have words built, so you have letters building words. So even things like speech wouldn't be possible within this type of world. So it just seems to be the case that you can't even explain your theory, because to use words, you then need to also be assuming that there are built entities that exist within reality. So it seems to be difficult. Sorry, when I use the word built, by the way, what I'm meaning is non-fundamental. So you have to sort of assume that there are non-fundamental entities to even communicate this specific theory. And then another reason why you need to reject it is because of simplicity. Because I'm not going to spend time on this. Again, I'll say people should read the book on this. But the view of simplicity that I look at is something called Schaffer's laser. So a lot of people might have heard of Occam's razor, which is that you should only postulate the fewest number of entities as necessary. But Schaffer's laser says you should posit the fewest number of fundamental entities. Now, the problem that you have with flat worldism is that it takes everything to be fundamental. So you're positing a very vast amount of fundamental entities. Okay, so we can sort of put that to the side for the moment, and we can look at the other alternatives. So you have something called metaphysical infinitism, and you have something called metaphysical coherentism. Now, metaphysical infinitism is just the idea that we have, the way I like to picture it is like a never-ending staircase. So you're never going to get to the bottom level. But there are sort of built entities. So you have one stair which is depending upon another stair, which is depending upon another, which is depending upon another. But you're never getting to the bottom. So infinitism just says there are non-fundamental entities within reality, but there are no fundamental ones. We have all these non-fundamental ones that are being built by others, but there is no ultimate fundamental one that's grounding it. It just goes on infinitely. So some of the audience might have heard of, obviously Aquinas's arguments against infinite regress. So it's very similar to that you just have an idea that all the non-fundamental entities within reality are just built by other ones which are non-fundamental, but we never get to the level of there being a fundamental entity. And then metaphysical coherentism is just the idea of the circle. So everything is built by everything else, but it sort of ends up that whatever is built by something else also builds that thing. So there's a circle of builders. So infinitism is sort of the infinite staircase or ladder that just keeps on going down. And coherentism is just the infinite circle that you never get to an end point. It just keeps on going around. So something is built by something else, which is built by something else, which is built by something else. But there is no fundamental entity that sort of stops the building cycle. So anyway, so you have these two views, and they both explain why there are non-fundamental entities. Why is there this cup here that exists, which is non-fundamental? Is because it's built by something else, which is non-fundamental, and so on and so forth. And that's what infinitism is. And with coherentism, it's the same idea, but it's just sort of loops around in a circle. And so the challenges that you have with this view that I put forward is that it seems to violate something called the kind instantiation principle. Now, the kind instantiation principle was put forward by a philosopher called Ricky Bliss, where she was trying to say that in her own work, she was saying that the reason why we need to posit fundamental entities as the sort of ultimate builders of all non-fundamental entities is because if you just put forward a non-fundamental entity in your explanation to explain another non-fundamental entity, you can have that particular one being explained. So why this is being explained is because something else builds this glass, okay? Something else is sort of supporting the existence of this glass. Or let's say the water. The water is a non-fundamental entity that's being grounded at this moment by this glass. And then the glass is being, held in existence by gravity and so on and so forth. But the problem that you have is you can have every instance of a non-fundamental entity being explained, but you cannot have the category of non-fundamental entities being explained themselves. Why are there non-fundamental entities in the first place? Not the particular one, like the cup or the table or the chair, but why are there any non-fundamental entities in the first place? You cannot just put a non-fundamental entity as an explanation of why non-fundamental entities as a whole exist. And so that's the kind of instantiation principle, that you need a fundamental entity to enable you to explain why there are any non-fundamental entities in the first place. Now, I sort of put forward in my own work a specific variant of that because there are some objections to a theory. And just not to go into the depth of it, so again, I do encourage people to read the work. But in the specific version I put forward, is that I put forward the idea that there is a universal of non-fundamentality. So everything sort of instantiates a universal, and non-fundamental entities, they instantiate the universal of non-fundamentality. Now, what explains that existence of that universal? Because something needs to explain it. And I sort of give reasons why universals need to have explanations for their existence. And so something needs to explain the universal of non-fundamentality. Now, the instances of the universal cannot explain why that universal of non-fundamentality exists in the first place. So you need a fundamental entity that's going to explain why there is that universal of non-fundamentality in the first place. So anyways, with sort of the kind of instantiation principle in hand, we can then see that the infinitist view and the coherentist view seems to violate this, because at the end of the day, if we have an infinite sort of ladder going downwards or infinite staircase going downwards, we don't have an explanation for why that staircase exists in the first place. So we don't have the explanation of why there are non-fundamental entities in the first place by just pointing to the infinite steps that are in the staircase. And same thing with coherentism. By just pointing to other ones in the circle, I'm not explaining why the circle is there in the first place. So the key thing is here, with the kind of instantiation principle in hand, and so the specific version I put forward, there needs to be an explanation of why there are non-fundamental entities in the first place. And infinitism and coherentism do not do that. So they're not evidentially accurate with that specific one. And then there's also complexity problems with infinitism and coherentism. I'm not going to go into it, but in order to make sense of it, you need to sort of put forward certain metaphysical laws to make sense of infinitism and coherentism, and they are very complex. And so it sort of increases the complexity of the specific theory, so you're losing out in simplicity. So the key thing here with this analysis, what we've seen is with flat worldism, we seem not to have the virtue of simplicity, we seem not to have the virtue of evidential accuracy. And when we look at infinitism and coherentism, we lack also simplicity again, and we also lack evidential accuracy. But this is not the case when it comes to metaphysical foundationalism, because we're only putting forward foundational entities, and you can put forward, as I would myself, only one fundamental entity, so you're only positing one thing. And you don't need any complex laws to make sense of this entity. And it also fits with the kind of instantiation principle, because we can explain why there are any non-fundamental entities in the first place by positing this fundamental entity. So what we get to at the end of the day is a conclusion of stage one, is that foundationalism is the best theory, and it then allows us to move on to Paul B, which is sort of the meat of the discussion that a lot of people want to look at. But it's very important at this stage. So if there's anyone who's ever interested in researching this more, or sort of defending the argument that I'm putting forward, this stage is very important, because you'll have some people arguing and saying, well, where's God here? We haven't got to God yet. But we need to make sense of why we need to put forward foundationalism as a theory, to sort of as our working theory, because there are other theories that people might put saying, oh, we don't need God to explain non-fundamental entities because we have an infinitist view. So there is no need for a type of fundamental entity, or we have a coherentist view. So stage one allows us to generate these frameworks: infinitism, coherentism, foundationalism, flat worldism. And then given the sort of virtue theoretic analysis, we then filter out all the other ones. So flat worldism, infinitism, coherentism, they are put to the side. And then we say foundationalism is the explanatory framework that we want to look at. And so that allows us to then move on to pool B, which is then going to be stage two of the analysis, to try and understand what's the best foundationalist theory of reality. And that's where it sort of gets interesting. Suan, if there's any point you want to stop me, by the way, please do. I'll be more than happy because I can speak for 10 years.
Yeah, well, here's what I'm thinking, Joshua. So I do have questions already about the presentation, and maybe it might be good to just, rather than at the very end, have to go all the way back to the first section. It might be good to just ask them at the end of each section. How about that?
Okay. Perfect, yeah.
Okay, and just to also give you a breather in case you need to take a break. Yeah. So one thing I was just interested in was the terminology that you're using.
Yes.
So, for example, and this isn't like a substantive question. This is just presentation.
Yeah.
So, for example, take you mentioned metaphysical coherentism.
Yeah.
And I've typically heard that just described as causal loops. Or for example, metaphysical foundationalism as just causal finitism. Is there a specific reason why you kind of use the terminology differently? Is there an actual nuance that would be missed if I just called it causal finitism?
Okay, so the reason why you probably wouldn't want to use that language is because in the metaphysical literature itself, the relation that's sort of put forward between non-fundamental entities is the grounding relation.
Right.
And grounding is normally seen to be a non-causal relation. So when we're saying that there are fundamental entities that sort of are at the foundation of everything and everything is built upon them, what sort of relates them to all those other built entities is a non-causal relation called grounding. And then with also infinitism as well, most philosophers will say coherentism, they would say in this sort of loop that we have, there's a non-causal relation that's sort of linking them all together. So they might sort of, in the literature itself, this is sort of the language that is used. So I do sort of recommend people, if they're interested, looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia. So you'll have, if you type in foundationalism, you have a very good article there, and there'll be other ones for coherentism and infinitism. But this, the language I use as well is also utilized in epistemology. So some epistemologists will sort of say things like epistemic foundationalism or epistemic infinitism. So it's sort of just mirroring that in the metaphysical field that people are using that language as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, because even Aquinas's like de ante argument, it gets to a foundational reality, but you don't really need to bring in causal finitism for that argument. It's a different type of beast. So and also just for like you I know you mentioned that like metaphysical flat worldism is not popularly defended, obviously because it's kind of a bizarre view. I don't know if you would know the answer to this, but for example, take the fact that we can destroy things even, or even I can cease to exist. It doesn't seem to be the case that I'm foundational, or excuse me, that I'm foundational. And I was wondering, do you know how like a flat worlder in a different context, how they would defend, the fact that things can seemingly be destroyed? Would they just say that's not the case, or what?
They might say that at the most fundamental level of what you are isn't destroyed. So if it's your sort of molecular structure or whatever, so the structure that you have, so let's sort of use that form and matter distinction. The form is destroyed, but the matter sort of exists in another form as such. So someone who might argue in that way would say that, you as this sort of structure, it no longer exists, but your atomic particles or whatever it is, the quarks that make you up still exist, and they are the fundamental things. That's what someone could argue. But again, I think they will just have a problem of saying to bite the bullet and say, a lot of them will just say, it just appears like that's the case. So if someone is interested, John Heil, who's a very famous metaphysician, he defends a sort of flat worldist view, which is interesting. And Graham Oppy, in a conversation I had with him a few years ago online, he sort of defended a similar flat worldist view and sort of slash infinitist view. So there are some people that will do it. It just doesn't seem to have good explanatory power for our appearances of reality. So the majority of philosophers will just say just nonsensical, but you find it. You find any position in philosophy and one defender also.
Right. And then maybe the last question I ask you is, I've heard a lot of people use like Peter Lipton's work on inference to the best explanation. And I was just wondering, since you've done kind of a combing of the literature, how does his thesis hold up for the most part? I still see it being cited often and quite favorably.
Yeah, so I'll say that I think it's one of the working models of IBE. But I think where the discussion that people didn't favor was that in his work, the second edition of his work, he tried to put IB together with Bayesian epistemology. So he tried to use a Bayesian view, so Bayesianism and IB, and he was saying that actually these two things can work together. So I think that was more rejected. But I think the general idea of IB from the way that he put it forward, I would say is one of the standard views, and I had very good reviews as well when it came out. So I think a lot of people utilize it. They might tinker it, but it's just a general framework. So he doesn't even give a very full-fleshed. I would even say that the way that I put it is more full-fleshed than the way that he did it. He just put a general scheme that when we do IB, we look for the loveliest explanation of the data. And then he put forward arguments why that's the case. And then the loveliest explanation is just the one that increases the most understanding. And so then with my own sort of take on this is that I'm saying it increases understanding because of the virtues that theory has. But I think his general scheme has been widely accepted, yeah.
All right. Well, that's all I have for now. And Joshua, please feel free to... Let's see. All right. Yeah, Joshua, please feel free to continue.
So there was just a bit of a lag. Yeah, perfect. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so yeah, let's move on to stage 2 of the analysis. So in stage 2 of the analysis, we are then focusing in on the specific theories within the metaphysical foundationalist family as such. Because what people understand is metaphysical foundationalism isn't actually a monolithic theory. There are different theories that we put forward. But the way that I'm sort of doing this, if people can remember, I can't remember if it's China dolls or Russian dolls. You know, we have one doll in a doll and in another doll.
Yeah, the Russian dolls.
Yeah, the Russian dolls, yeah. So, yeah, it's sort of like that. That's the approach that I'm putting forward. So the outer casing is stage 1, where we're trying to say which best family of explanations explains the existence of the non-fundamental entities. Well, metaphysical foundationalism was found to be the one. So then we look more into then sort of more narrowly into the theories themselves. So we now look at the family and we say, well, what's the best metaphysical foundationalist theory on offer to explain the certain data that we're looking at? So now we move from the existence of non-fundamental entities or the appearance of the existence of non-fundamental entities to now the features that the non-fundamental entities have. And that's going to be the thing that we try to explain. And in order to do that, we then need to look at what are the best metaphysical foundationalist theories on offer. Now, there are 2 main families of metaphysical foundationalism. So there's something called monistic foundationalism, and there's something called pluralistic foundationalism. Now, monistic foundationalism is just the idea that there is a single absolutely fundamental entity within reality. So there's just one fundamental thing within reality. That's why it's monistic. And then pluralistic foundationalism is saying that there are many fundamental entities within reality. So there are multiple ones. So if you can see as well, within those 2 families, there are different theories that have been put forward by metaphysicians. And so you have something called, which is my own theory that I put forward, which I call trope theoretic theism, which is going to be the theistic option. That falls into monistic foundationalism. There is monistic substantialism. There is pure stuff theory. And these are the 3 main theories that I put forward to analyze in the monistic foundationalist camp. And then in the pluralistic foundationalist camp, we have something called mereological bundle theory. We have extended simples theory, and we have something called priority-based structural realism. Now, don't worry about all of this now. I'm going to unpack it as we go through it. But it's just the idea that there is a family of the family of metaphysical foundationalism gets sort of specified in 2 ways as monistic foundationalism or pluralistic foundationalism. And so out of those sort of 6 options, we're going to try and understand what's the best theory to put forward as the best explanation. Now, in order to do that, though, we then need to sort of understand what is the best explanation of the data we're looking at. We need to perform an internal and external assessment, if you remember. So this is where in stage 2, you're going to do an internal assessment of the theories, and then we're going to do an external assessment given the certain data that we're looking at. Okay, so with trope theoretic theism, and what I'm going to do now for each theory, I'm going to introduce it briefly, and then I'm going to show how the internal assessment is performed. So trope theoretic theism is the idea that there is a God. So there's one God, a single being called God. But then God is identified as a maximal power trope. Now, for anyone that might have heard me speak or read my stuff before, this is something that I harp on a lot of the time, because this is sort of the concept of God that I've been defending. It's the idea that God is a trope. So he is specifically a maximal power trope. Now, if anyone, again, has also watched anything I've done or read stuff, they would have seen the term that I use of omnipotence trope, but I've sort of changed that now to maximal power trope, just because it fits more with the types of tropes that exist within reality. There are power tropes, and then I'm just saying God is a maximally powerful trope, instead of using the term omnipotence, which is more of a theological term. Okay, so when I use the term maximal power trope, what I'm meaning is that there is an entity, the single entity, which is a trope. So I'm not going to go into details here because it will just take us too long, but a trope is just a type of entity which is a particular nature. So you have this object, and this object is an abstract particular nature. So I'll give you an example. In this box of tissues I have here, for people who are trope theorists, which are many philosophers, they would say that this box of tissues has many tropes that compose this box. So this box isn't really a solid object. It's composed of many different tropes. And so there'll be a color trope, there'll be a weight trope, there'll be a size trope, and all these tropes make up this thing that we call the box of tissues. Now, tropes can be any size. So I'm not saying God is like a small little trope, like a color trope that makes up this table. But the key thing is that God is a trope. So he is this type of entity who has a certain type of character of power, and he bestows this power upon created reality. So he's a maximal power trope. So the power that he has is maximal in that there's no limitations. And by saying that God is a maximal power trope, we can then also derive the other attributes of God. So God is knowledgeable, he's free, he's good, he has maximal presence as well. Again, I don't want to spend time on this just because it will just take us too far afield. But again, I do recommend people to read the book. But if you don't want to read the book on it, because it is a long one and quite expensive, I have all of my papers on academia. And one paper where I introduce this is called Divine Simplicity, the Perspectival account, where I really go into depth about this trope theoretic view. But the key idea here is there is a single maximal power trope that exists within reality. The cool thing about this as well is that you're allowed to, or this enables you to hold to the idea of simplicity, because tropes are taken to be entities which are simple entities. By the way, when I use the word trope, that word trope it just popped into my head. It does come into sort of colloquial language, and I'm not using it in a colloquial sense. I'm using it in a philosophical sense as an abstract particular nature. Now, the cool things about tropes is that they're simple, so that means that they're not made up of parts. And so when I say that God is a trope, we can also affirm his simplicity. He doesn't have any properties. He just is whatever thing we predicate of him. And specifically, I predicate of him maximal power, so he just is his power. Now, the way I make sense of his other attributes is by saying that they are aspects of this power. Again, I'm not going to go into depth in this, so I do recommend people for the book and the simplicity paper. But the idea here is that God doesn't have any properties. He's a single maximal power trope, and anything that's predicated of him is going to be numerically identical to him, so he is simple. So when we have trope theoretic theism, the way that I do this analysis of these theories is that I put forward the theory and I put forward certain governing principles. So every theory is going to have an entity put forward, and it's going to have principles which are governing the theory. Now, I have trope theoretic theism, which is the idea that there is a maximal power trope, a single one. But then there are certain principles which I put forward called axiological principles. And these principles govern the specific theory. So if I have this theory, I'm also going to affirm these axiological principles. Now, there are three principles here. The first principle is the principle of goodness. And this is just the idea that all possible entities have goodness to a certain degree. So not every entity is going to have the same level of goodness, but every single entity has a certain level of goodness. The principle of diffusiveness is just the idea that goodness is necessarily diffusive of itself. So anything that's good is going to spread the goodness around its environment or around reality. And then the principle of plenitude is that no genuine potentiality can remain unfulfilled. So this is the idea that all potentials will be maximized. So if we sort of take this with theism, it's the idea that God's created reality. Everything that God creates is going to have a certain level of goodness. That fits with the principle of goodness. God is then going to diffuse the goodness that he has into all of reality. And then also he's going to actualize all the potentialities of things, because it's good to actualize potentialities. It's good for horses, camels, tables and chairs, not to just be potential things that exist, but to actually have actual existence. So the idea here is that we have these three axiological principles, which are also going to be affirmed by someone who's a trope theoretic theist. The key thing, though, is that these principles are not just affirmed by theists. These are principles which are held by many different philosophers throughout philosophical history. And so they're not sort of ad hoc principles I just put forward, but they're going to be important in generating the data that we're going to want to look at. But there are general principles that are affirmed by a wide range of philosophers. Okay, now, when we then move into our internal assessment of trope theoretic theism, remember the assessment that we are going to perform is going to look at certain virtues that it has internally. So it's going to look at the coherential virtues. It's going to look at the aesthetic virtues. So if you remember what I was saying before, the coherential virtues tries to look at the internal consistency, the internal coherence, the universal coherence, and the aesthetic virtues looks at the beauty, simplicity, and unifying ability of the theory. Now, with trope theoretic theism, and for all the theories, we look at three things, which is coherence, theoretical commitments, that's just simplicity, another term for that, and then unification. Now, when we perform the assessment of trope theoretic theism, we see that it passes this internal assessment to the highest level possible. Firstly, if it fills the criterion of coherence, we can call it, because it is an internally consistent theory. And this is not sort of being laid out here, but if you go through the book, I define each of the attributes that God has, and I show that they make up a maximally consistent set. So there is nothing that is incoherent in the attributes that God has. So God's maximal power, his maximal goodness, maximal presence, maximal knowledge, they are all things which make up a consistent set. So the theory that I'm putting forward is internally consistent and also internally coherent. There's no sort of ad hoc supposition that I'm putting forward. And then the key thing as well, it's universally coherent. If you remember, the idea of universal coherence is the idea that does it fit with other theories in other fields. Now, given that God, I've defined him as a trope, tropes are things which are affirmed by philosophers in a wide range of different philosophical fields, specifically metaphysics. And so the key idea here is that you then have the trope theoretic view fitting with the other trope theoretic views that people have outside of theism. So we have an entity that we're putting forward, which is also of the type of entity that's affirmed by other philosophers. So why this is important is because this is a dissonance that I have with Swinburne, because Swinburne defines God as a spirit, and a spirit wouldn't be a universally coherent thing, because it will be something which is affirmed in theism, but it won't be affirmed in other sort of metaphysical theories and views, because people don't theorize about spirits. But tropes are things which are theorized about widely in metaphysics. And so the entity that God is a type of entity that will be theorized in other areas. So you have universal coherence. It seems to fit with other theories. Theoretical commitments. So what we have here is it minimizes the amount of entities that we put forward. So again, I'm not going to go into defining what ontological and ideological commitments are, but the key idea here is that any commitment that we're putting forward is going to be to the minimum level, because we're only positing one entity. We're positing a single maximal power trope. So it's going to be the simplest entity possible, just one. And then also, because God doesn't have any properties, he also is a single entity who has zero properties. If you really think of the type of entities that exist in the world, even if you posit one entity, that entity is going to have properties. So, for example, I'm one entity and I have properties of skin color, height. Some people might say good looks, whatever it is. You have, I have all of these attributes of, wearing a red shirt. So these are attributes that I have, but they are not. Even though I'm a single entity, they render me as a complex entity. But what we have here is, because God is a single maximal power trope who has zero properties, we're passing an entity that has the fewest commitments that people need to make. I'm just committed to there being this power trope. I'm not committed to there being properties that exist. I'm not committed to there being kinds. So we have I would say the fewest number of entities posited, and so we have a minimalization of the amount of commitments that someone has to make. And then we have unification here, because when we put forward this idea of a maximal power trope, because God is maximally powerful, any data that we put forward is going to be unified under him, because God is supposed to be the creator and sustainer of all reality. So what we have here is that we're now able to unify all the data that exists within reality under this single explanatory framework of God is the creator of it. So God is, when we posit him, he's the unifying factor within reality. So what we have here is that we have the virtues of simplicity, unification, and all of the coherential virtues being affirmed by trope theoretic theism. And again, this is unpacked in a lot more depth in the book. But then this allows me to sort of conclude about trope theoretic theism that it's the internally loveliest theory. Okay, it's a very internally lovely theory because it exemplifies all of the specific internal virtues. So coherence, simplicity, unification. So it has all of those. So it's an internally lovely theory. And so to be able to then select this theory, we don't just need it to be internally lovely. We need it to be externally lovely as well. And that will make it the loveliest explanation. But before we can do that, we have to go through the other theories and then also look at the data itself. Okay, so just very quickly with monistic substantialism, key things here is monistic substantialism was put forward by a number of philosophers, but one of the main proponents is Jonathan Schaffer. And it's the idea that there is a single fundamental entity, but a single fundamental entity is the universe itself. So the way that he sort of sees this is that the universe is the fundamental entity and everything is a part of the universe. So we have one single thing and the single fundamental entity is the universe itself. So all other material objects are non-fundamental. So I'm non-fundamental, you are, all the tables and chairs, they're non-fundamental because they are grounded by the universe, which is a single fundamental entity itself. The governing principles that we have are not axiological principles of monistic substantialism, but they're fundamentality principles. So the first one is priority monism. It's the idea that the cosmos is a single fundamental entity that's ontologically prior to its parts. So normally we see parts being prior to the whole. So if you have a car, we would say the car's parts were put together and it made the whole. But he flips this around and priority monism says the whole is actually ontologically prior to the parts. And so that's one principle. And then the tiling constraint is just the idea that there is, the whole of the cosmos is a sum of all fundamental entities. So all fundamental entities are composed of, in a way, they make up the universe. Again, not to go into depth in these things, but there are certain governing principles. These two principles govern monistic substantialism. Okay, then when we perform an internal assessment, what we realize is that there are many challenges when it comes to the specific criteria that we're looking at. So coherence, theoretical commitment, so simplicity, and unification. Because if we were to go through this, and I'm not going to spend time going through it, we'll see that there are actually seemingly problems when we come to this. So, for example, with internal consistency, we seem to not be able to make sense of how there are material objects and why there is this, why there are independent material objects and why there is this fundamental entity which is independent. Because in this view, all material objects are, as I said, parts of the fundamental cosmos, but they are actually spatio-temporal regions of the cosmos. And so The problem we have here is, how do you make sense of, so basically I'm a spatio-temporal region, that's what I really am ontologically, of the cosmos itself. So then how do we make sense of our interrelations that we have with ourselves, with the cosmos? How do we make sense of the properties that we exemplify? So there seems to be consistency issues and also coherence issues. And then universal coherence, there's a problem with most theoretical physicists who are working on something called quantum gravity, which is sort of I'll not call it experimental field, but sort of a research field that's trying to make sense of the general theory of relativity and also make sense of quantum mechanics, how these sort of things work together. And so you might have heard of things like string theory, loop quantum gravity. And so theoretical physicists who are working in quantum gravity, the majority of them affirm the idea that the cosmos is not fundamental, that the cosmos is a derivative entity. So the problem that you have here is that if you hold to monistic substantialism and say the cosmos is the single fundamental entity, you seem to lack universal coherence. It doesn't fit with these other seemingly more evidentially grounded theories that you find in quantum gravity. And someone who's sort of, inclined towards science, they wouldn't want to be putting forward metaphysical theories which seem to go against our best science at the moment. Now, this is not to say quantum gravity is well established. These are sort of, at the theoretical stage, but they are things which are, as when it comes to like string theory and loop quantum gravity, they're the best theories that we have at the moment, and they don't seem to fit with monistic substantialism. So we seem to lose out in universal coherence. And then when we come to theoretical commitments, we have a problem here. Even though there is one single entity, which is the cosmos exemplifies a near infinite amount of properties. So if you remember, I said I and everything that exists as a material object is a spatio-temporal region of the universe itself. And so the key idea here is, according to Schaffer, is that all the properties we have, they're actually possessed by the universe. They're not possessed by me. I'm just a region of the universe, and the properties are pinned onto the universe itself. So that means all the properties I have, all the properties in this room, all the properties around our reality, which is just the world and the galaxies and the universe and maybe potentially a multiverse, all the properties that make up, and there are near infinite amounts, they are exemplified by the cosmos. So the cosmos, if you're affirming this idea, you're committed not to just a single entity, you're committed to a near infinite amount of entities, which are the properties of this specific cosmos. And so this seems to be something which maximizes commitments instead of minimizing it. And then we also have the problem of unification, because if we take everything to be spatio-temporal, we take the single substance to be the spatio-temporal thing, and we are all regions of it, then again, how do we make sense of properties which don't seem to be spatio-temporal, like universals, for example? How do we make sense of certain quantum phenomena, again, which doesn't seem to be residing within this spatio-temporal region? So things like the wave function, as we'll see later. So we seem to have problems in unifying certain data within reality when it comes to monistic substantialism. So it seems to be an internally unlovely, it's supposed to say unlovely theory. So it's not lovely, it's unlovely. And so let's move on to pure stuff theory. So pure stuff theory is a third theory in monistic foundationalism. And it's just the idea that there is sort of this thing called stuff. And this stuff is this non-spatio-temporal, unchanging, featureless fundamental entity that makes up everything. So sort of for Thomists in the audience, this will be sort of this prime matter idea, or sort of this matter that makes up everything. So it's this idea that everything that's made up is made up ultimately by this stuff. So we are objects, but we are objects which are derivative entities, because we are made up at the more fundamental level by this thing called stuff. And this was put forward by a guy called Ned Markosian. So even the word stuff sounds very silly, but it's actually an idea, and it's a very well-respected philosopher. It's just the idea that at the fundamental level, we have stuff. And not to go in depth with it, but there are sort of two principles that govern it. The idea that we have a fusion of stuff. So any portion of stuff will have a fusion. So any stuff that you have will make up further stuff. And then also you have this doctrine of wholly arbitrary portions. So any sub-region will then be occupied by these stuff as well. So if you have an object, the sub-regions of those objects will be occupied by stuff. So anyways, we don't need to go into depth about the principles, but just an idea that we have this idea that the single fundamental entity in reality is stuff, and this theory is governed by certain ontological principles. When we perform an internal assessment, we seem to have problems again. When it comes to coherence, we seem to have contradictions. When it comes to making sense of how does non-spatiotemporal featureless stuff constitute spatiotemporal objects. So I'm in space and time. How does my stuff that is non-spatiotemporal, that's featureless, how does it make me up? And I have many different features. How does that all occur with this sort of featureless stuff? It also seems to have internal coherence problems because it doesn't seem to make sense of the vast diverse properties that we have within reality. So there are certain conceptual gaps that we face. It doesn't seem to fit with universal coherence as well. It doesn't fit with other theories that wouldn't posit stuff. So in the majority of philosophers and scientists are not going to be, thinking, theorizing about stuff. They're going to be theorizing about quantum phenomena and things like that, fields and stuff like that, but they're not going to be utilizing stuff. So stuff seems to be only something that's put forward within this idea, this pure stuff theory, but it doesn't fit with other things which are being theorized about. Then we have problems with theoretical commitments, because even again, while there is one fundamental entity, this stuff seems to be able to make up all these other different types of stuff. So again, we seem to have problems here in making sense of how many entities actually exist, because the properties I have, they need to be made up of my stuff. So all the properties I have again are going to be sort of elements of the stuff. So the stuff isn't really a featureless thing. So it even gets confusing explaining it. It's not really a featureless thing because all the properties I have are going to have to be made up of the stuff. And so all the infinite properties I have, the reality has, it's going to also mean that there seems to be not this single stuff, but there are infinite varieties of stuff. So we seem to have many ontological commitments that we need to make. And then again, we have problems with unification. When you have physicalist theories, for example, doesn't seem to posit and fit with this idea of stuff. So when we have physicalist data of reality, it doesn't seem to fit with it, and it doesn't seem to unify all of those sort of phenomena that we put forward. Sorry, I'm speeding through this, but I'll just like to get through this as much as I can without people sleeping. So so that's an unlovely theory. Again, so we only have trope theoretic theism at the moment being the lovely theory, and all the other two are not, because they don't seem to have the virtues. When it comes to mereological bundle theory, mereological bundle theory is put forward by a person called L.A. Paul, Laurie Paul, and it's the idea here. So now we've moved on to the pluralistic foundationalist view. So we've moved off the monistic view, and this is the idea that there are plurality of qualitative properties which are the fundamental entities within reality. So this might be the way that people view reality a lot. So sort of I'm made up of all of these bits and pieces, and these bits and pieces, these small really bits and pieces, make up and compose me. And this is sort of the idea she has here, that we are made up fundamentally by qualitative properties. So everything at the fundamental level are properties, and these properties come together in compresent bundles. So they come bundled up, and then they make up whatever object we're trying to posit. And so at the fundamental level, we only have these qualitative properties. And so the governing principles that we have here, we have certain axioms that she puts forward, and she has also something called priority pluralism. She doesn't use this terminology, but it's a terminology that fits with it. So it's the idea that instead of priority monism, that the whole is prior to its parts, the idea here is that the parts are prior to the whole. So whatever the cosmos or reality is, the thing that's going to be ontologically prior to it are the qualitative properties. So we have these two governing principles over this specific theory. When we perform an internal assessment, we seem to have a problem again. When it comes to coherence, so for example, it seems to face issues in its over-reliance on properties. So we have this idea that we have properties which are fundamental, but then we don't seem to make sense of how we have this composition of all these entities that are made up of these properties. So it doesn't seem to fit with this idea that we have these fundamental properties, but these properties can also stand in this constitutive relationship with the objects that they make up. So it seems to have consistency and coherence problems. Again, it seems to have universal coherence problems because there are certain theories in physics which don't seem to posit properties of this as sort of fundamental entities. We have things like fields that seem to be the fundamental entities for a lot of people. And so the problem that we have is, how would this fit with this idea that everything's made up of properties, these hard properties that are brought together to make up every object that exists? Then we also have problems with theoretical commitments, because when we look at this, we're positing a near infinite amount of qualitative properties that need to make up all of reality. So every single thing that exists within reality is made up of bundles of these properties. So we have to posit a very, very vast amount of properties just to make sense of reality. So it seems to be that we have many commitments that we have to posit, that we have to be committed to. So again, it maximizes commitments. And then unification as well, because it over relies on properties. How does it make sense of things which are not taken to be properties? And so we seem to have problems with this. How do we make sense of things which just don't seem to have that property sort of aspect to them? It doesn't seem to unify those areas of knowledge that we might be positing in metaphysics. Sorry, just also with internal consistency, just going back to there, there's also a problem because these properties, she does argue that the properties exist without a substratum. So there isn't anything that's underlying the properties. The properties just bundled together. But again, how do we make sense of the persistence of these properties without there being something that sort of holds them together, or they're reliant upon? So again, it seems to be that we have this inconsistency or sort of problems with coherence. Again, sorry, I'm speeding through this, but I would say do have a look at the book, because when you sort of see the arguments, you'll see that at the end of the day, it does seem to be another internally unlovely theory. Okay, then we have extended simples theory. So this is another theory in pluralistic foundationalism. And this was put forward by a guy called Chris McDaniel and Peter Simons, a few others as well. And it's the idea that there are a plurality of fundamental entities, and they are things called extended simples. So extended simples are objects which seem to lack proper parts. So they're material objects. So that means that they're spatially extended, but they do not have any proper parts. Now, trying to visualize that is very difficult, because anything that you visualize being spatially extended would seem to have parts that you can sort of break them up into. So, for example, there's glass and other things. But what we're saying here is that there's something spatially extended which doesn't have any proper parts. Now, this theory, again, which is a well-respected theory, it has governing principles. The key one is the extended simples principle, which is just the idea that every fundamental physical entity occupies an extended region without having any proper parts. So it's sort of just repeating the main idea in the theory, but that's the principle governing. That anything that's simple, anything that's fundamental will be simple. That means that it will lack any proper parts, but it'll also be able to be spatially extended. Now, when we come to this, we have a lot of issues, specifically internal consistency. How do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of things being spatially extended, but they're being indivisible because they lack proper parts? You won't be able to divide them. How does that make sense? Because anything that seems to be spatially extended can be divisible in a way. So we have problems with identity and differentiation when it comes to this. It also, basically, to make sense of this, you have to utilize something called the extrinsic theory of shape. Again, I won't go into this, but that's a way to make sense of this theory. But it's also a problem in trying to render that theory as coherent. So it seems to be that it's an ad hoc supposition that's added to this theory to make sense of it. Universal coherence, it seems to conflict with other fields like electromagnetism, fields that posit also things theorizing about gravity. So the entities that are posited in these sort of things are not, they're spatially extended, but they are definitely made up of proper parts. So how do we make sense of this? Again, it seems to be, I'm only committed to extended simples if I hold to extended simples theory. But going again to trope theoretic theism, if I can be committed to tropes without being committed to trope theoretic theism. So that's the important thing about universal coherence. So trope theoretic theism, again, fits with everything, but EST doesn't, because other fields in science and other fields in metaphysics don't seem to take things being spatially extended, but being able to lack proper parts. And then also, again, we have problems with theoretical commitments, because we have to posit a high number of extended simples to be able to make sense of all the entities that exist. So similar to the problem you have with mereological bundle theory, that you have to have a near infinite amount of extended simples to just make sense of the reality that we see. So you have a maximal amount of entities. And so what we can say is an internally unlovely theory. All right, last theory, priority-based structural realism. So this is the idea. It's defended by Stephen French and James Ladyman. So this is something called structural realism, but the specific version I'm looking at is by a person called Kerry Mackenzie. And she put forward this idea that the fundamental entities within reality are relations. They're not objects, they're not entities which are able to be particular objects instantiating properties, but we have these relations which then give rise to objects. So relations are at the fundamental level of reality. Now, the governing principles that you have here are fundamental relations. So relations are ontologically fundamental. They are the truth makers of any relational judgment that we make. And relational identities, entities exist and have their identity through the relationships with other entities. So the identity that I have and the existence I have is in virtue of the relations that I'm standing in. So relations are the most important things. Objects like ourselves are not important. It's the relations which are the fundamental things. Now, problems that we have with this is that how do you make sense of all these things? Because again, internal consistency, how can we maintain this idea that structures, relations are more fundamental than objects without implying that objects are necessary? It seems to be that objects are needed to define the relations and the things that they're in, the relations that exist. So the structure and the relations that people stand in, they seem to only make sense, or the relations that we're positing, if there are objects that we're speaking about. So it seems to be in defining the relations I'm going to put forward, I need to also utilize objects in my definitions. So it seems to be that they are as fundamental as each other, relations and the objects. And so we seem to have inconsistency in making sense of this. Again, we have problems with universal coherence as well. There are certain theories which posit entities with intrinsic properties, because the idea here is entities do not have intrinsic properties. They stand in relations. Those are the key things and not the intrinsic properties that they possess. We have things like fields and particles in quantum field theory, which seems to posit entities with intrinsic properties. And then also when we come to theoretical commitments, we have a high number of commitments that are made because you have to posit a high number of relations in order for these entities to exist. So I exist in virtue of the structures and relations that I'm standing in. And then in order for anything to exist, any object, there needs to be relations that they stand in. And so the problem that you have is that you have to posit a near infinite amount of relations just for all the objects that we can think about, just in the known universe itself. But if we have, let's say, a multiverse or whatever, you just have to think about the amount of relations that have to be posited. So I have to be committed to a very vast amount of fundamental relations that exist within reality in order to make sense of this. So we have a maximal amount of commitments that have to be made. And again, we seem to have problems with unifying conventional ontologies that don't posit relations as the fundamental entities. How do we make sense of these? All of these entities that exist, it seems to not have great explanatory power when it comes to these conventional ontologies, which are more entity or object centric, where they're focused more on objects than relations. How do we sort of bring that into the explanatory framework that posits relations as fundamental? So it seems to be that PBSR is an internally unlovely theory. And so what we can sort of conclude at this point is that trope theoretic theism is the only theory which is internally lovely. Every other theory is taken to be unlovely because they do not possess the virtues of coherence, because of consistency problems, internal coherence problems, universal coherence, and they seem to lack simplicity. So they seem to commit one to many theoretical commitments. And then also there's problems with the unifying factor that comes to all of these theories. They don't seem to unify the data and postulations that we make. But trope theoretic theism does that because we posit one single entity, has zero properties, falls into zero kinds. It's a maximal power trope. And so this being that's maximally powerful, we unify all postulations that are put forward. And it's also all of the attributes that are predicated of him are maximally consistent, so there wouldn't be any internal consistency, coherence problems. And because it's a trope, it also is universally coherent. So it's the only one that seems to pass through our internal assessment, and we can then deem as internally lovely. Sorry, I don't know if you want Suan to ask any questions at the moment before I go into the last sort of element of this.
Yeah, so far what you've been doing is just eliminating the alternatives to trope theoretic theism and you're using the criteria that you set out in the first section.
Yeah.
Is that a
So
fair summary?
yes, I'm doing it, but it's not. I would say it's not. They're not eliminated until the end. So
I see.
they failed the first test, which was the internal assessment. So looking internally at each theory, do they have the certain virtues that are important? Coherence, simplicity, unification. And what I'm showing is that only trope theoretic theism has that. That's even without looking at the data. When we then look at the data, we're then going to move into our external assessment and say, does it have the evidential virtues? So is it evidentially accurate with the data we're looking at? And so then let's say we get to the end and trope theoretic theism is the only one that's internally and externally lovely. We can then select that as the loveliest theory of reality and its features.
And one question I wanted to ask you was, obviously your preferred form of theism is what you call trope theoretic theism. But I mean, there are obviously other versions of theism that are out there, other ways that people would metaphysically want to cash out theism. So I'm interested, like, obviously there has to be like a limit, right? You can't take on every form of theism and so on and so forth. So, um, how do I put this? How should we understand your decision to choose trope theoretic theism? Are you trying to just say that, hey, here's my version of theism and it seems to hold up really well? You're not necessarily saying at this point it's the only form of theism that one can hold. Like, how do we take this?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's the only one that we can hold.
Right.
But my argument is that I believe it's the best metaphysical picture of theism. Because why it's the case is because what we have. So let's say we take the view that Swinburne puts forward. So Swinburne puts forward the idea that God is an omnipresent spirit. So it's an omnipresent spirit who exemplifies the property of essential omnipotence. So God is omnipotent, but he's a person and he's bodiless, so we can term him as spirit. Now, let's say we have that and we have my trope view. Okay. Now, why I would want to take my view over Swinburne's, for example, is because when we then look at the virtues and we do this internal assessment, again, we're positing a single entity each. So we're both on par when it comes there. One entity for me, one entity for him. But then when we're looking at the other entities that we have to be committed to, we have to be committed to more entities within his view, because he would say that God has the properties of essential omnipotence and all the other properties that he has. So he posits a number of properties that God possesses. My view would say, no, God doesn't have any properties because tropes do not have properties. They are metaphysically simple. So we don't have to then be committed to a high number of entities when it comes to this one. So that will be one up for me over Swinburne's view, because I don't have to be committed to a high number of entities when it comes to properties. But then, and this is the key one, why I would say a trope is important is because we're trying to also have a universal coherence. We want to put forward a view of God, which is not just going to be rejected out of hand. Oh, no, I don't believe in spirits, so I'm not even going to look at this view. So that's what someone would say, because if they look at Swinburne's view, they'll say, well, Swinburne posits a spirit, and spirits are not things that we think about in any field outside of, let's say, theology or spiritual sort of aspects. But what I'm saying is tropes are things which are dominant in metaphysics. So a lot of philosophers will affirm them in different areas. And so even Schaffer himself is a trope theorist. So even one of the guys I'm taking on, he himself is committed to tropes. So what I'm doing is saying, yeah, but I can be committed to this entity who has universal coherence. So it fits with all our background theories. But the view that Swinburne will have wouldn't fit because it'll be a spirit. So that'll be out of sorts with the other theories. But then let's say you take someone else's view. So someone might take a view of saying, okay, I don't want to take Swinburne's view. I want to take the view that God is a simple being. Okay. Now, let's say a Thomist view or another view of God, where God is a simple being. Now, I'm arguing for that as well. I'm saying God is a simple being, but I go more specific to saying God is a trope, because why I'm doing that again is because I'm trying to get that fitting with the background theories. But if you just say God is a being, for example, or he is being itself, I mean, what does that mean when what does that actually mean at the ontological level? What type of entity are we putting forward? Someone might say, well, he's above being called an entity. Okay, fair enough. Well, what are we talking about then? How are we supposed to perform our analysis here? When we perform our analysis, we need to be as specific of what we're talking about as possible, because that's what the other theories are doing. They're very specific in the entities that they're putting forward, with Schaffer's view and Paul's view and others. And so I need to be very specific in what I'm putting forward to see if I can actually perform a very good analysis of it. And so why I would favor my view is because you can have what the Thomist is trying to say. God has all of the things he wants to say. Simplicity, he's identical to everything you posit of him. He can be timeless in my view. All these views that you want, God has in this view. The only thing is that I take a more specific view and say he's actually this trope, and that allows me to have my foot in the door in the conversation to say I'm actually putting forward an entity that you yourself is committed to. You have to tell me why this entity type of entity you're committed to cannot be maximally powerful. Because if he is, then that being is God.
Yeah, and just to kind of maybe branch off of one point there really quick, and I know we need to get moving with the presentation still. And by the way, Joshua, if you ever need a break, just let me know.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
So, I mean, basically saying is that we need to use the language and in the literature of analytic philosophy in order to have this conversation, right? Because on the one hand, like my friends who are scholastics, are probably very comfortable like not being in that analytic conversation. But you're kind of saying to do this investigation, we need to kind of characterize it using the language of analytic philosophy, kind of not using maybe the terminology that other Thomists would be generally familiar with.
Yeah, because I think because with my work, for example, I don't do a lot of exegesis or any exegesis of Aquinas, and I haven't really defended anything. But I feel that I'm working in the spirit of Aquinas, because Aquinas took the best philosophy of his time. So he, when they were rediscovering Aristotelian metaphysics and physics, and it coming through sort of the Islamic philosophers and then into sort of Aquinas's hands, he was taking the best philosophy that they had at that time. There wasn't anything better than Aristotle's philosophy, maybe some Platonism and stuff like that. But so what he was doing, he wasn't looking back. He was looking at what the present moment was the best philosophy. That's a similar thing that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say, can we do this taking the best philosophy possible? Because what someone's going to do at the moment, if you're speaking to someone who's just not a scholastic or who's not a Thomist, they're just not going to be able to understand the terms you're using. So the conversation is not even going to work. But what I'm trying to do, and again, this is just the Swinburnian in me, is saying, let's play the atheist, naturalist, or whatever at their own game, and see if we can actually come through it. And that's what Swinburne did throughout his whole thing. He took the best philosophy and tried to show how it sort of leads to God. And I'm trying to do that as well, saying the best metaphysics possible, we can construct our concept of God, and then we can actually utilize the best concepts available to then argue for his existence. And so we don't necessarily, this doesn't mean you have to let go of what you're holding to in your scholasticism, because what I'm doing again fits with what Aquinas was saying. So I have an article for those who might be interested. Elucidating divine atemporality. So it came out earlier this year, where I actually do all of my work with Trope theoretic theism, and I try to show how timelessness can be held in my view. I'm going to try to make sense of timelessness. And this is arguing against people like William Lane Craig and others who try to argue against it. And so anyways, what I'm showing is that you can have all of the classical theistic view that you want, but I think it's good to also update our philosophy if you want to have a conversation and you want to have sort of, again, a foot in the door, or have the conversation with other metaphysicians who are not going to. Because my work as well, because it was an in-depth work, I'm not expecting your average layman to be reading the book, but if someone is interested, that's great, and I really, I'm really grateful if someone does that. But I'm also wanting to speak to other metaphysicians and saying, actually, look, God needs to be put back on the table. Because that's one argument that I have in the book, which is sort of running through the whole thing, where I'm saying that and I do this in the introduction. I give a historical sort of analysis of how God used to be at the center of metaphysics. The best metaphysicians were theists. They were thinking about metaphysics through their theistic sort of viewpoint. So Aquinas and Augustine, all these sort of individuals. And then what happened later on, I sort of argue and show how it's like human, Immanuel Kant, and then sort of the methodological naturalism sort of moved religion away from the metaphysical discussion. And so what I'm trying to argue is that actually, because God is going to be shown to be the best theory that makes sense of our metaphysical reality, he needs to be back at the center of metaphysics. And
Right.
so I'm sort of speaking to the metaphysician as well, the contemporary metaphysician, who would say actually God isn't something we should be thinking about.
And let me just ask you one very quick short
Yes.
question, and then we'll get going with the
Yeah.
rest of the presentation. It seems like to me in this internal assessment part of your
Yes.
presentation, the main objection that you'll probably get from, let's say, somebody who's a monistic substantivalist, right,
Yes.
believing that the universe, right, is the one fundamental entity in some way, or the other view that you mentioned, EST,
Yeah.
they're probably going to argue, they're going to try and show, let me ask you, is this correct? The general strategy that you've seen these individuals take is just to say, well, look, theism, trope theoretic theism is in some way is no better, right? In terms of the virtues, right? I mean, that's generally the most modest strategy that you can take. Not to say that one view has better virtues than the other, but if
Mhm.
they can just say, hey, our virtues are about the same, actually. So
Yeah.
there's no reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So because with all of the metaphysicians I've looked at, they haven't sort of done this type of analysis. So all of the theories I put forward, but I can sort of picture someone like a Graham Oppy
Yeah.
arguing that sort of way, saying actually they're just equally virtuous.
Right. Right.
Um, but again, let's say we take monistic substantivalism, and it says that there is a single entity that is the universe, and we are spatial temporal regions of it. But it seems to be the case that again, how many things do I have to be committed to when it comes to this entity? Like, what commitments do I have to sign up to? What do I have to tick? What boxes do I have to tick? Well, I have to tick that there is a cosmos, which is fundamental, but I have to tick that we are not really material objects, we're spatial temporal regions, okay? But then also I have to tick that, well, what about all the properties, all the characteristics, all the features that make up these spatial temporal regions, which we are? Well, I have to tick that there are near infinite amounts that the cosmos itself has. And so what happens is that you seem to have many more commitments that you have to make. So let's say you have object, the universe, and you have properties, okay? But then when it comes to trope-theoretic theism, you just have object, but you don't have properties. So it won't, just even at that level, if we're going really nitty-gritty, we will just say, actually, no, there are more entities you have to be committed to. You have to be committed to a vast amount of properties that make sense of this viewpoint. But I didn't have to do it because I'm taking my entity to be a trope who is identical to its nature, and so wouldn't then need to have all of these properties. And so there doesn't seem to be the commitments that I have to make. But I'd love to see the pushback that someone like that will make on that, and I think it would be important. Yeah.
All right, Joshua, I'll let you keep going.
Perfect. Yeah. So this shouldn't take too long, but I'm gonna again try and whiz through this. But this is probably the most important part. And so anyone who does read the book, this is the one that takes up the most space. I think this area of the book is maybe a good 300-400 pages. So I'm trying to, as much as possible, summarize it as clearly as I can, but also swiftly as I can, not to take too long. So after we perform the internal assessment, I sort of argue that theism, trope-theoretic theism, is the internally loveliest theory, but we cannot conclude that it is the loveliest theory in general. We can't select it as the loveliest theory because there is a second assessment that needs to be made, which is the external assessment. And so this is now assessing it in light of the data, because it could be, for example, that you have a theory that is the most coherent, it is the simplest, and it is the most unifying, but it doesn't explain the data that we want to look at. And so this internal sort of assessment is only important if everything is the same when it comes to external assessment. So you might hear this a lot with simplicity, for example, that simplicity only comes in our sort of evaluation of a theory once everything is equal. Okay, if all of the evidence is pointing to both theories, then the simplest theory is the one to be posited. Now, this is the same thing. If all of the evidence is pointing to all of the theories I put forward, then theism wins out by being the internally loveliest theory. But I want to take it even further here and say that actually all of the evidence doesn't point towards any of these theories that we're going to look at. It's going to only point to theism. And so we'll have theism being the sole internally and externally loveliest theory, and the one that we need to select. So it is the most powerful theory we can put forward. Now, this means then that the focus that we're going to be looking at now is no longer, as we were doing in stage one, the existence of non-fundamental entities. What we're looking at now are the features of the non-fundamental entities. So whatever the non-fundamental entities are, let's just call it non-fundamental reality. We will now say that there are 6 elementary features of non-fundamental reality. So I call them the elements. So the physical elements, the temporal elements, the ontological elements, the relational element, the personal element, and the experiential element. So these are all elements of non-fundamental reality. They're features that non-fundamental reality has. It has physical features, has temporal features, ontological features, relational, personal, and experiential. Now, again, this is going to be sort of a very wide view going into a very narrow view. So the physical features of reality is going to be the largest one. And then it moves into the temporal one, moves into the ontological, moves into the relational, personal, and then experiential one. And so all of these elementary features, they now are put on the table as phenomena that needs to be explained by our 6 theories. And so something I'm not going to go into now, but a pushback that someone might have is, well, why should I take these features to be needing explanation? Why do these features of reality need to be explained? Now, in the book, I sort of, again, spend time arguing in each chapter that each of these elements that we're going to look at are non-fundamental elements. And so they need to be explained, because when something's non-fundamental, it then requires an explanation. So the physical elements, reality, the temporal ones, these are all non-fundamental elements, I argue in the book. And so they need to have an explanation. So this is sort of just something that I ward off an explanation. I ward off a specific critique that someone could put forward, saying, why can I not just take the physical elements of reality to be fundamental, so it doesn't need to be explained? But I provide an argument for why that cannot be the case. So anyway, so the metaphysical question that we're trying to answer, and so we're looking for a metaphysical explanation, is a question of what makes it the case that there exists the physical, temporal, ontological, relational, personal, and experiential elements of non-fundamental reality rather than none. So why does reality have these features? What makes it the case? And we then need to say it's one of these theories that we've looked at. Now, let's say we look at the physical element of reality. Now, I'm not going to, again, spend a lot of time at all doing this. But the physical element of reality is focused on quantum mechanics. Now, why I'm focusing on quantum mechanics is because quantum mechanics is the most studied, I would say studied and verified form of science that we have today. And so it's a very important field. And the interesting thing is quantum mechanics, if I've probably ever looked at natural theology, has never played a part in sort of arguing for or against God. So sometimes it's brought up as an objection to something, but it's never actually put forward as data that needs to be explained by theories. But what I say is that the non-fundamental entity that we call reality has a physical element of reality that we study in quantum mechanics called the wave function. So the wave function, again, this is not, because we've already been going a long time, and a lot of people might be out their brains at the moment, but just the idea that the wave function is a mathematical tool that scientists use to make sense of the quantum phenomena that we observe. But then there's something called wave functional realism. It's the idea that the wave function is not just a tool, it's actually a physical object that exists in a higher dimensional space. So we have 2 different spaces that exist. We have our space, which is a low dimensional 4D space. And then we have this sort of 3n dimensional space, which exists. So we have these 2 different spaces, and we exist in this space, and the wave function exists in the other space. And the wave function is the thing that sort of grounds our own existence. Okay. So anyways, it's this object, it's a field that exists in a high dimensional space as this wave function. Now, the question that I have is, well, what makes it the case that there exists this non-fundamental physical element of reality? What makes it the case that there is this wave function that exists? And remember, because I've argued that the wave function in the book is non-fundamental, this question is important. What makes it the case that there is this wave function? But another important thing about the wave function is there's something called the wave function collapse. So people might have heard of this idea that, you know, with the double slit experiment and other things like that. It's the idea that when the wave function is being observed, it collapses into a definite state. So basically, the quantum phenomena, the quantum system is a wave, and then when it's been observed or measured, it then becomes a particle-like entity. It becomes definite. And so the problem that we have here is why is it that the wave function collapses? So it goes, every time it's observed or measured, it collapses. And it's a real big problem in the foundations of quantum mechanics. It's called the measurement problem. Why is it the case that the wave function collapses in this way? And so there are these 2 phenomena. which are part of the physical elements of reality. There is a wave function that exists, and it collapses during measurement or during observation. Why does that happen? What makes it the case that it exists and that it collapses under measurement? And so what I then do is I perform then an external assessment. So I go through each of the theories and say, do these theories actually fit with, so are they evidentially accurate with the wave function and its collapse? And should we be expecting this, given the truth of the theories? So given the truth of monistic substantialism, trope theoretic theism, or whatever, should we expect there to be a wave function? So if I just believe in trope theoretic theism, should I also be expected to believe that there'll be a wave function that exists as well, and it collapses? My argument for trope theoretic theism is that yes, we should be expecting this to be the case. And so just to summarize what I argue here, the idea here is that we should take there to be a wave function existing and collapsing under measurement if there is a God, if there is this trope, this maximal power trip. Why that's the case is because given the specific principles that we have, so if you remember the principles of goodness, diffusiveness, and plenitude, we should expect God to bring something like the wave function about. Because, for example, if we look at the goodness principle says that there is, everything has a certain level of value, certain level of goodness. And the key idea here is that things can have different levels of goodness. Now, the wave function will be something which has the highest amount of value and goodness possible, because something that's also argued in the book is the more complex the structure of something is, the more valuable and good it is. So the goodness and value of the wave function will be extremely high given the complexity that it has. The wave function existing as a field which grounds every other thing that exists from its high dimensional space is an extremely complex structured entity. And so the value that it will have will be very great. And because God will then be guided by something like the goodness principle, he will see there's a great amount of value in the wave function. And so would want to bring this sort of thing about. But also because the wave function operates and it grounds everything that exists, it'll also be a good way for God to diffuse the goodness that exists within the world. Because the wave function allows evolution, according to the Schrödinger equation, and it also allows things to be entangled, we would expect there to be a diffusiveness and a connectedness to reality, which God will want, given the idea of diffusiveness. And then also this idea of plenitude. I didn't go into this, but again, with the book, I would say people to read it, because it's the idea of superpositions. So the wave function, prior to measurement, is in a superposition of states. So, for example, if you have a quantum system of something being in the spin up and spin down, the quantum system is in both those states before measurement. It's spin up and it's spin down. Or people might have heard of Schrödinger's cat, where the cat is both dead and alive. So anyway, the whole point here is that the wave function, before it's measured, it's in these two different states. And so the key point is that that means that every potential is actually actualized within reality before measurement. And so again, the wave function is something that enables all potentialities to be actualized. So given these three principles that we have, and God is maximally powerful so that he can bring this type of entity about, this will be something which God will see of great value, which has diffusive ability when it comes to goodness, and plenitude as well. So he'll want to bring this type of entity about. So given that there is a God and these principles are operative, we'll expect there to be something like the wave function. And then secondly, we'll also expect there to be the collapsing of the wave function, because the collapsing of the wave function is very important for God. Because if you think about it, so when we look at the wave function collapsing, it's normally at the microscopic level, but not to go into like a great amount of depth. The microscopic sort of superposition that things are in, so something being in spin up and spin down, this sort of trickles up into the macroscopic objects. So things are in superposition states at the microscopic level because of something called decoherence and entanglement. Everything in the environment with that quantum system will also end up in a superposition state. So this is that Schrödinger's cat. So I'll just sort of run through the cat example, actually will be helpful. So you have a vial of poison, which is in a box with the cat, and you have a Geiger counter, which sort of sees when a certain quantum state sort of decays. And so if it goes into a state of decay, it will break the vial open, and so the vial will be broken open, and the cat will die. Now, given that quantum systems are in superposition states, they would be in a state of spin that causes decay, and a state of spinning in another way that doesn't cause decay. So the problem that you'll have is this will then mean that the poison is released and the poison is not released, and this will then mean that the cat is dead and the cat is not dead. So the key point is, when things are in superposition states at the small level, they also sort of trickled up into the big level that everything will be in the superposition state. But we don't see that. I don't see things being dead and alive. I don't see things being in one state and in another. I see them in definite states. Why is it like that? Because the wave function collapses. Well, we can think about God and his goodness. Why would he want the wave function to collapse? He'll want it to collapse because if it didn't collapse under observation, certain things wouldn't be able to exist within reality, such as freedom of the will, such as scientific observation and development. Because if we are making scientific observations, but everything is in the superposition state, we wouldn't be able to then predict things. But also, we wouldn't be able to have freedom of the will. Because if things are both dead and alive, I cannot choose then to cause something to be dead or for me to allow it to be alive. So anyway, the key point is God will have good reasons to want to collapse the wave function, because it will allow things like scientific observation and allow things like freedom of the will when the superposition sort of through decoherence goes up into the macroscopic level. So anyways, key thing here is we should expect there to be a wave function, and we should expect there to be the wave function collapsing if there is a God. But we shouldn't expect it if there isn't. And why that's the case is because when we look at the other theories, we don't expect them to actually bring about the wave function or its collapse. And so, for example, when we have the monistic substantialist view, we shouldn't expect there to be a wave function, because the monistic view says that the space-time cosmos is the fundamental entity, and so there is no other higher dimensional space. There is only this single space with the spatio-temporal universe being the fundamental entity. But actually, we have a problem here, because the wave function is supposed to be more fundamental than the spatio-temporal universe that it grounds, and so it doesn't seem to fit with the idea of the wave function. Pure stuff theory, again, why should we be able to make sense? Like, the wave function is not made up of stuff, it's a field, so it's not made up of stuff. So why should we expect there to be a wave function existing if there is just stuff existing at the fundamental level? Mereological bundle theory, is the wave function made up of qualitative properties? Again, we seem to have a problem here in making sense of it. How do we also make sense of the space that the wave function is supposed to exist in? If there are just qualitative properties, should I expect there to be a wave function? Should I expect there to be the high dimensional space? That shouldn't be the case. And same thing with extended symbol theory. If there are just these entities which are spatially extended, but they have no proper parts, why should I expect there to be a wave function? So you have all these problems of, given that there are these entities, let's say it's a spatio-temporal universe, or its qualitative properties, or its extended symbols, or its relations, why should there be a wave function? I shouldn't expect any wave function to exist. I should also not expect it to collapse. Just because there is a universe, why should the wave function be collapsing? Just because there are this stuff that exists in the world, why should it be collapsing? So there's no good reason to expect these things to be occurring, to exist, and to be the event of the collapse to be occurring if there is this wave function. And the principles that govern each of these theories don't seem to lead me to expect it either, in the same way that theism and its principles lead me to expect there to be the wave function is collapse. Why should the fundamental principles of priority monism, for example, where the whole is ontologically prior to its parts, why should that lead me to even believe that there'll be a wave function? It shouldn't. I have no expectation of these things existing. So what we have here is that it doesn't seem to be evidentially accurate. It doesn't seem to fit with it. We don't have a causal mechanism as well. Why should the wave function exist? Well, if there is a God, we have a causal mechanism. It's God who brings about the wave function and causes it to collapse. But we don't have that when it comes to the other theories. And then same thing with explanatory depth. We don't have a very deep explanation. We have a superficial explanation at all. So what we have here is, at the end of this assessment of the physical elements of reality, we have trope theoretic theism maximizing explanatory power relative to the wave function and its collapse of the physical element of non-fundamental reality. And so the metaphysical answer that we have is that the existence of a fundamental entity identified as God makes it the case that there exists a non-fundamental entity of reality that is identified as the wave function and its collapse rather than none. So God is the one that makes it the case that there is this physical element to reality. Okay, when we move on to temporal reality, and I'm going to be a lot quicker with this one. So what this is now we're narrowing it. So now we have the wave function, and we have the wave function existing in the high dimensional space, and we have our space. So now we're moving off the wave function in the high dimensional space, and we're now looking at our space. And this space is the temporal element of reality. And so the key idea here is that there is, for a lot of philosophers, our space is a 4-dimensional space-time block. So we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. So it's a 4D block. So you can just picture in your mind just literally a 3-dimensional block in your mind, but it's 4D. So it's this block, and everything exists within this block, within our space. And so the key point is we have this 4-dimensional block, and we have entities that persist within this 4-dimensional block. So we have this block, and we have all these entities that persist within these blocks. So I persist just means I exist at different times. So I exist at one time, and I exist at another time, and I exist at another time. So we have all these entities that exist within this block, and we have the block itself. So the question is, what makes it the case that there is this non-fundamental temporal element of reality, this 4-dimensional spatial-temporal block, and the entities that persist through it? So what makes it the case that there is this phenomena? Now, when it comes to trope theoretic theism, again, we have a similar thing. So I'm just going to be very quick with this. So we have God existing, and God being maximally powerful, he can bring about this 4-dimensional block. And so the key point here is that God's nature fits with it. He has a type of nature where he can know of all things, and so he can see things in a 4-dimensional way at a certain point in time, or outside of time. And then also he has the power to bring about this block. But then we'll have God having the intention to do it, to bring about this block and the entities within it, because of the principles working again. The 4-dimensional block has a great amount of value. It's also, because there's a 4-dimensional block where everything exists within the block, there will be a diffusion of goodness throughout of all of reality. So, for example, a good way to see this is if you take another view, which is the 3-dimensional view, or the presentist view, but the only thing that exists within reality is the present moment. So you have like this slice of reality, and it just moves at different times to different things. The 4-dimensional view is the idea that we have a block where everything exists at the same time. Okay, everything is just there. So Hitler, for example, is at an earlier time of the block than we are. Dinosaurs are in the early time of the block, but they all exist within the block now. The key point is we'll have a great amount of things that exist within reality at this moment, and so we'll have a great amount of value that exists. We'll also have different sections of the block where all of the moments that exist, they permeate through all of reality and across time. So we'll have a diffuseness, sort of a generation of more goodness around the block. And again, because everything exists within the block, there's a maximization of potentialities. Everything that exists just exists within the block. So there isn't just things existing at the present moment. Us and Hitler and dinosaurs don't exist. Everything just continues to exist in the block. And so we have the maximization of potentiality. So we have good reason for God to want to bring this about, because it fits with goodness, it fits with diffuseness, it fits with the plenitude. So we should expect there to be a 4-dimensional block, given God and the principles that we have. For those who are interested in time travel, I also go into time travel as well. And I have a mini argument, which is quite interesting. So yeah, just anyways, it's something that people might want to look at, because there's something in the literature. Time travel in the metaphysical literature is something which is actually well accepted that it's possible. But a problem that you have is why people have this problem with time travel is, how can you sort of change the past? So it's called it's a famous thing called the grandfather paradox. Could I go back in the past and kill my grandfather? It seems to be the case that I can't. And one of the main philosophers on this is David Lewis, and he argues that the reason why I can't go back and change the past is because there will be something which stops me at every moment. If I was trying to shoot my grandfather, my gun will stop working, or I'll slip on a banana, or be something. Now, it sounds very silly, but it's actually a very well-respected view that Lewis put forward in the literature, that it is logically possible to travel in the past, because there'll be something that stops us from changing the past. Now, I actually put this idea of saying, well, what is this thing? And Lewis floats this idea of a chaperone protecting the past. And it's quite interesting, but he sort of doesn't take that view. But I actually argue, well, if there is a God who creates this four-dimensional reality, he would want people, if we ever get to the point of being able to travel in the past, to actually stop people from changing the past, because that will change a lot of things that you want to take. You want to come to pass. So anyways, that's not an argument at all. That's a big argument, but it's a sort of side note that I have there, which is quite interesting. So we have all of this explanatory power when it comes to time, and for dimensionalism, when it comes to God, we should expect there to be this reality, but we shouldn't expect it again with the other theories. Again, I'm not going to spend time here, but just the key point is, when it comes to substantialism, why should we expect there to be this 4D block? When it comes to pure stuff theory, if things are stuff, why should we expect there to be this 4D block? Why should we expect there to be persisting entities? If everything is just properties, again, why should we expect there to be this block, which is this object? It's not properties. If there are extended simples within reality, why should we expect there to be this block? If there are only structures and relations, why should we expect there to be this block? Why should we expect things to be persisting? So again, it doesn't seem to be, if I'm committed to these things, why should I also be led to this view of four-dimensionalism and all these sort of things of there being a 4D block? If there is a God, I can expect, because of the value that's had with these things, given the goodness principle and the other principles, that I can expect there to be this 4D block and the entities that persist. But why should I expect it with the other ones? I shouldn't. And so we get to the point of, again, sorry, I'm really rushing, but we get to the point, and arguments are sort of given for each of these things failing. But we get to the point of trope theoretic theism, again, being the one that maximizes explanatory power relative to this temporal element of reality. And so we have, again, what makes it the case that there is this temporal reality identified as the four-dimensional space-time and the persisting entities, is that there is a God that brings it about. Then ontological reality. The idea here is that there are four fundamental ontological categories within reality. So this, again, is the ontological element of reality. So we've moved from there being a wave function. We've moved from there being a four-dimensional block of space, time. We're now moving into the categories that these entities exist within. So we have the wave function. The wave function grounds a four-dimensional block, and there are persisting entities within this block. And these entities now fall into four ontological categories. So the four ontological categories are objects, properties, modes, and kinds. So everything that exists is going to fall into this. Either something's a kind, something's an object, it's a mode, or it's an attribute, it's a property. And so we have these four categories that exist within reality. Now, the question is, what makes it the case that there are these four ontological categories? And the second data as well in this view is essences. Things have essences within reality. What makes it the case that things have general and individual essences? So an essence is something that makes me what I am. So I am what I am because of my general essence, maybe being a human. And I am what I am individually, Josh, because of my individual essence. Now, what makes it the case that things have essences and there are these ontological categories that they fall under? Now, when we again look at trope theoretic theism, I'm going to be even faster with this one. But when we look at it as well, we should expect, because the great amount of value that's had when we look at this, each category in essence embodies a great amount of intrinsic value. So we should expect these things to be existing. Again, it also allows there to be a dissemination of goodness, because there are all of these entities that exist. So we have the four categories. And the reason why they're four is because, and this is the work of E.J. Lowe. By the way, each of the data I look at focuses in on the sort of main philosophers that have defended these viewpoints. And so with this view, Jonathan Lowe argued that we only need four categories, because four categories explains everything that exists. So why God would want to make four categories instead of one is because it brings about more value. Not just having objects, but having kinds and having modes, and having attributes that increases the amount of value that exists. It also allows things to be more diffusive in their goodness. If objects just exist, but they don't have properties, they're going to be less able to bring about goodness in the world. I need properties, I need modes, I need kinds. And so anyways, when it comes to the goodness principle, when it comes to diffuseness, when it comes to plenitude, we should expect there to be these things, these categories, because of the amount of goodness and value that they have. And so God, if there is a God, I'll expect him to bring about these categories and to bring about these essences. But I shouldn't, again, expect these things when it comes to the other theories. Again, if there is a universe, why should I expect there to be ontological categories? If there is stuff, why should I expect there to be properties? Why should I expect there to be kinds? Why should I expect these things to have essences? Why should I expect, if there are qualitative properties in mereological bundle theory, why should there be objects? Why should there be kinds? Because even mereological bundle theory is one category ontology, so it doesn't even posit objects, it doesn't posit kinds, it doesn't posit attributes. So I shouldn't expect these things to exist. If there are simples, I shouldn't expect these things to exist. And same things with relations. If there are relations, why should I expect there to be any objects? Why should I expect there to be all these things? So we have this problem. It doesn't seem to lead us to expect the existence of these distinct categories. It doesn't lead us to expect there to be essences. Why should I hold to essences if these things exist? So we don't have any good reason. But with trope theoretic theism, we do. We have good reason to expect these things to exist, given the amount of goodness that they have, given the principles that are operative and the nature that God has, who's maximally good and maximally powerful. He can bring these things about, and he'll want to do them because they fit with the specific axiological principles. So what makes it the case? Again, it is because of God. Then when we look at the relational elements of reality, this is now looking at grounding and things called powerful qualities. Now, grounding is the relation that connects all non-fundamental things to more fundamental things. So if you have something that's less fundamental, so let's say you have, again, you have this glass that I have in front of me. This is less fundamental than the gravity that's sort of keeping it in existence in a way. So the key point that we have here is that you have less fundamental things which are being grounded by more fundamental things. And so there's a relation that connects them called grounding. And then we also have things called powerful qualities. So some philosophers believe that there are powers that exist within reality. So powers, I don't mean like Harry Potter powers and stuff like that. I mean powers as in properties. And these properties are powerful things. So, for example, an electron is able to repel something and stuff like that because it has a certain powerful quality to be able to do that. So anyways, we have these things, and powerful qualities enable us to stand in causal relations. So the key thing here is grounding relates the more fundamental to the less fundamental, and powerful qualities enable us to stand in causal relations. Now, what makes it the case that there are grounding relations within reality and there are powerful qualities that exist within reality? We have the same type of arguments put forward. Grounding is a very, very complex entity because it connects all the less to the more fundamental entities within reality. And powerful qualities as well. They enable all these things to stand in causal relations, so they'll have a great amount of intrinsic value. They also enable goodness to be spread. So the goodness of a more fundamental entity is able to spread its goodness to the less fundamental entity. By the way, when I mean goodness, I just mean existence. So I don't just mean, happiness and goodness in that way, but I mean the less fundamental entity is able to ground the more fundamental entity and so provide it with its goodness. So the less fundamental entity derives its existence, its goodness, in a way from the more fundamental entity. And so there's a diffusive ability that grounding provides for things that exist within reality. And the same thing with powerful qualities as well through causation. And then also as well, by things standing in grounding relations, things are able to actualize certain potentialities that they have. And this is the same thing with the powerful qualities with the causal relations as well. I'm able to exemplify certain things because I can cause certain things to exist because of the powerful qualities that I have. So if there is a God, I should expect there to be these things because of the amount of value and their fit with these certain principles. But is that the case with the other ones? Again, I'm arguing that that's not the case. Why should I expect there to be grounding relations? Now, it's interesting because when it comes to Schaffer, so the guy who's a proponent of monistic substantivalism, he argues for grounding being the thing that ties the more fundamental universe to its proper parts. But then I argue in the thing saying, actually, it doesn't seem to be a relation of grounding that we should expect with monistic substantivalism, but we should expect there to be a relation of proper parthood, and proper parthood and grounding are not identical. They're not the same relation. So we shouldn't expect there to be grounding relations. We definitely shouldn't expect there to be any powerful qualities. If we are spatio-temporal regions, why do I have a powerful quality to stand in causal relations with other spatio-temporal regions? And so we shouldn't expect any of these things when it comes to monistic substantivalism, pure stuff theory, all the other theories that we have. If things are just relations, if things are just stuff, if things are just simples, if the fundamental entity is just the universe, why should we expect there to be any grounding relations at all? And why should we expect there to be any powerful qualities? It seems to be that we don't need these. We shouldn't expect these entities grounding and powerful qualities if these more fundamental entities exist. So they fail to lead us expect grounding relations and the powerful qualities. But again, theism doesn't. Theism allows us to have maximal explanatory power. We should expect there to be these relations and the powerful qualities if there is a single maximal power trip. So what makes it the case that there are? Again, the answer to our question is that there is a God identified as a maximal power trip. Okay, this is we got two more data. So personal reality is now we've got even more narrow. So we've moved from the wave function, we've moved from our four-dimensional space, we've moved from the four categories and the essences that the entities within our four-dimensional space instantiate. And then we move to the relations. So the relational elements reality, the relations that these entities are standing in, grounding relations, and the powerful qualities that enable them to stand in causal relations. And we move even more narrow into now what are these entities? They are this is the personal elements reality. They are objects, they are persons, and they have freedom. And so the question is, what makes it the case that there is this personal elements reality? What makes it the case that there are objects? What makes it the case that there are persons? Some of these objects are persons, and what makes it the case that these persons have libertarian freedom? And so the key point here is the way that we conceptualize these things. So an object, given a neo-Aristotelian view, is a structured whole. So something's only an object if it has a certain structure. And then the way I see persons are as non-Cartesian substances. So a person is a psychological substance that has a first-person perspective. And then libertarian free will is just the idea that you are the ultimate creator of your choices. What I mean by that is you're ultimately responsible for the choices that you make. That doesn't mean that you would have you'll have alternative possibilities at each point. Libertarian free will, according to people like Robert Kane, just requires that we have self-forming actions where there are certain things in our causal chains of our actions where we were the ultimate determiner of the choice that we made. So the key point is here, we have structured wholes that are objects in reality. We have these objects being persons, so they have first-person perspectives, and they have libertarian free will in that they're ultimately responsible for their actions. And the question is, what makes it the case that there are these things? Now, someone might push back a lot more on this and saying, well, I don't conceptualize objects and persons and freedom in this way. I'm a compatibilist, or I see persons in different ways, or I see objects in different ways. Now, the key thing I want to highlight here is, firstly, in the book, I give reasons to believe each of the data that I put forward, because remember, something to be data has to have good reasons in favor. So any of the data that I put forward, there are good reasons. But something I want to argue as well here is that even if you don't conceptualize these things in the way that I do, the argument still works. Whatever way that you conceptualize these things, given that there is a God who's maximally powerful, maximally good, and the principles that we have, it's going to lead us to expect there to be objects in whatever way you conceptualize it. It has to be that they have to have a great amount of value. And so, yeah, there's good reasons to believe it, but even if you have a different view, the argument will still work. But anyways, in arguing for this, again, it sort of follows the same thing. God has the power, he has the knowledge, he has the goodness, so he has the ability to bring these things about, to bring about these structured wholes, to bring about the persons, and to bring about their ability to have freedom of the will. Why would he want to do this? Again, because of the principles that are operative. The goodness of a structured whole, again, remember, the more complex an entity is, the more value it has. And so if you have objects who are very structured, they will have a great amount of value. If you have persons have first-person perspectives, and they are non-Cartesian substances. And so they again have a great amount of value because of their complex structure and the freedom of the will as well. The ability to be able to make choices seems to make something more complex. I would say for example, my glass here, which I love to use as my example, it doesn't have freedom of the will, and so it has complexity, but it doesn't seem to have the complexity to someone who can learn Latin, for example, freely choose to learn Latin or freely choose to do these things. The ability to freely choose something seems to make me more complex. Or let's say I have a robot who is programmed to choose things. I would say someone who has the freedom of the will to actually choose things at a certain point in time would be more complex as an entity than someone that's programmed to choose things in a way. So again, it increases the complexity. And so something that God would want to bring about are entities which are structured wholes, which are persons, and which also have freedom of the will. And so we'll expect these things to exist within reality. And again, the same thing works with diffuseness and plenitude. But then when we look at the other entities, again, this is even worse for them because we shouldn't expect any of these things within reality. We shouldn't expect there to be these structured wholes because I'm a spatio-temporal region in monistic substantialism. So why should I have any structure that comes to me, that is of me, that makes me into a material object? Why should I be a person under monistic substantialism when there is just this universe? Why should there be any persons? Why should these persons have freedom of the will? If there is stuff that exists within reality at a fundamental level, again, why should there be objects that are structured? Why should there be persons? And why should they have freedom of the will? And you can play this off for the other theories as well. If there are qualitative properties, if there are symbols, if there are relations within reality, why should we expect there to be any persons, any objects, any freedom of the will? We have no good expectation to these things. So they seem to lack explanatory power. That means evidential accuracy and any causal mechanism for these entities that exist within reality. But when it comes to trope theoretic theism, as I said before, it seems to maximize explanatory power relative to this specific data. And so what makes it the case that there is this personal element to reality is that there are objects, persons, and the ability to have libertarian free will is because there is a God who makes it the case that there is so. Okay, now we come to the final element, which is the interesting one for people. So this is the experiential element to reality. So we've sort of had our cake and eaten it in such that all of the elements of reality seem to favor theism. So when we move from our physical elements to our temporal, to our ontological, to our relational, to our personal, they seem to all favor theism over the other theories. But when we come to the most narrow field, which is the experiential field, so we have objects, these objects of persons, they have libertarian free will, but then they experience suffering. That is the experiential element of reality. So the question is, what makes this the case? Like, why should there be any suffering? This seems to be a problem for trope theoretic theism. What makes it the case that there exists a non-fundamental experiential element of reality identified as experiences of suffering? Why should there be this within reality? Now, something first, we need to define what suffering is. So I'm not looking at evil because evil is a very general category. I'm looking at what's even harder than evil, which is suffering, which is defined in a way. So this is taken from the philosophical literature as well. An unpleasant experience consisting of a sensation and a desire for that sensation not to occur. So a suffering is just an unpleasant experience. And it's consisting of a sensation, something I'm feeling, and a desire that I don't want that sensation to occur. Now, if I'm putting my hand, for example, I'm really cold, and I put my hand on top of something quite warm, I'll be feeling a sensation, okay? And it might be slightly unpleasant for my body, but it might be something which I want to occur because I'm cold. So that wouldn't be suffering. But if I put my hand on something, and let's say I'm stuck, and I put my hand on something in, fire or something really hot, there'll be an unpleasant sensation. And if I have properly functioning cognitive faculties, I wouldn't want that to happen because it's going to burn my hand. And so that will be suffering because it has those two elements. It has sensation, a sensation, which is an unpleasant experience consisting of sensation, and it has that desire for it not to occur. Now, the question is, why should reality be like this if there is these theories? Now, the first thing is, so the way that this works now, it's going to be slightly different from the way I've been approaching it. I'm going to say at the beginning, it seems prima facie to be the case that theism has a problem when it comes to this experiential element of reality. Okay, that's the way that we normally take this. Theism doesn't seem to explain very well at sort of face value that there is suffering in the world. Now, the only reason that we can explain that there is suffering in the world, or the way that we can make this compatible, is that if the only way that this is compatible is that if the suffering brings about a greater good, then it's something which is compatible with God. So suffering and God are compatible if God permits suffering for the sake of a greater good. So the way that what I'll need to do is to show that the suffering experience of reality brings about a greater good, and that makes it compatible. So this sort of falls into the greater good theodicies as such. So theodicies, for your audience, a lot of them will know what it is. It's just a justification for why God allows suffering. So what I need to do here is I need to provide a way to show that suffering, so this unpleasant sensation that I want to stop occurring, brings about a greater good, and that will then be compatible with God. Now, the way I do that is through focusing on two things, something called exemplarism and something called transformative experiences. So this is something that fits into something that I call the exemplarist theodicy. So in my book and in a prior paper, but the book is what I would say people need to read because it's an updated version of the paper, I put forward my own theodicy that I call the exemplarist theodicy, which tries to put forward a possible reason for why God allows suffering to occur within reality. Now, the exemplarist theodicy focuses on two things called, first thing, as I said, is called exemplarism, and the second thing is called transformative experiences. Now, exemplarism is a moral theory that was put forward by a philosopher called Linda Zagzebski. So she put forward a theory, and it's nothing to do with theology or theism. So it's a general non-theistic theory of morality, which tries to explain the nature of morality by focusing upon exemplars of morality. So exemplarism is just a moral theory that the way that we can understand our moral concepts, so things like moral values, things like moral obligations and duties, they can be understood by our exemplars of morality. So what it means for something to be good, or what it means for something to be valuable, or something to be obligatory, or something to be whatever, is based upon our exemplars that we see within reality. So she uses ostensive definition, which is the idea that you define something by pointing out an example of it. So for example, like redness, I can only understand what redness is by seeing an example of it. Now, she's sort of arguing in a similar way that we only know morality by the exemplars of morality. So the way that we understand what goodness is by pointing out good people and saying goodness is like that, like Jesus, like Mother Teresa, like someone else. That's what goodness is like. That's what obligation is like. That's what this is like. So the key point is here, instead of taking a deontological view, or taking a consequentialist view to morality, or taking a sort of virtue theoretic view, she takes an exemplarist view, saying our morality is understood by exemplars. Okay, and the way that morality gets spread around the world is by exemplars and admiration. So in order for me to understand what morality is, I look at an exemplar of morality and I admire that person. I have the emotion of admiration, and then I want to emulate that person. And when I want to emulate that person, I then become an exemplar myself. And so it sort of spreads around. And so in the book itself, I give sort of a diagram. The way that morality spreads around is by one exemplar being admired by someone else, who then, through that admiration, that tries to emulate that individual and then becomes an exemplar themselves. So think about it like candles lighting another candle. One candle lights another, which lights another, which lights another. And so the key point here is that's how morality sort of is understood and spread around the world, is through exemplars of morality, and because of the emotion of admiration. Now, the second concept is transformative experiences. Now, this was put forward by L.A. Paul, so the person I was speaking about before with mereological bundle theory. She's very famous for another thing that she theorized about, which is transformative experiences. So she says that within life, we go through various transformative experiences, which are epistemically and personally transformative. Now, she, in her book, it's not really relevant, but she sort of gives examples of what a transformative experience is by looking at the example of what it means, like how would it feel to become to become a vampire. If I was to become a vampire, I will have to transform epistemically the way that I view the world and the way that I am personally, morally. I would have to also change as well. So she gives that sort of fictional example. She gives other examples as well. But the key point is that within reality, we go through things in reality that causes us to transform, and we transform in our knowledge epistemically, and we transform personally. And this can happen bit by bit. And this is this is a real reality for people. You transform on a daily basis by your knowledge. You might learn things, and so you transform your knowledge daily. And then also personally, by acting in a certain way, doing certain things, you also personally change yourself. So we go through transformative experiences, which can happen on a daily basis, or it can happen at a sudden moments where you go through something maybe traumatic, or you go through something great, and it changes you epistemically and personally. So, anyways, the key point here is that we have transformative experiences, and we have exemplarism being the moral theory that we're looking at here. So, given these two concepts, I then put forward the exemplarist theodicy. So, the exemplarist theodicy is the idea that suffering provides us with the opportunity to transform into exemplars of morality. So why there's suffering in the world is because suffering brings about the greater good of undergoing a transformative experience into an exemplar of morality. Now, Linda Zebzetsky in her work gives three categories of exemplars. So you have the saint exemplar, you have the hero exemplar, and you have the wisdom exemplar. So you have someone, you can be an example of morality when it comes to your sort of courage. So you are a hero. So you have people, she gave examples of, let's say people in World War II who were going and helping the Jews who were being taken to the Holocaust. They were examples of morality and specific to the virtue of courage. They were very courageous. Or you might have saintly virtue. So let's say Mother Teresa or someone else who would be an exemplar of someone who would be a saint in the sense of that she was out there helping people and loving people and caring for people, but she might not have been a hero exemplar, but she was a saint exemplar. And then you have also wisdom exemplars. So she gave the example of Confucius, and there'll be other people like the Buddha or Jesus or all these other religious figures. They are taking people who have great wisdom, and they will be people who are very wise, and so they'll have the wisdom exemplar. So the key point here is that let's say we take these three categories of exemplars. So you have wisdom, you have saint exemplar, and you have the hero exemplar. Now, the key point I'm arguing here is that suffering provides us with the opportunities to experience to undergo transformative experiences, that is epistemic and personal transformation, into saint exemplar, a wisdom exemplar, or a hero exemplar. And there could be other exemplar categories as well. So suffering provides us with these opportunities. Why that's the case is because in order for me to be a saint exemplar, I need to acquire the virtues of things like empathy, things like sympathy, things like compassion. These are virtues that enable me to become that type of exemplar. So in order for me to have empathy, in order for me to have things like sympathy and to have compassion, there needs to be bad states of affairs. There need to be suffering experiences. I need to go through bad sensations that I don't want, or someone else has to, in order for me to be able to feel compassion towards them or sympathy towards them or something like that. So in order for me to be able to even become a saint exemplar, there needs to be suffering that I experience or someone else experiences. In order for me to become a hero exemplar, there needs to be bad things that are going on in the world, because I need to acquire the virtue of courage. But you can only have courage if things are not going very well. If there wasn't things like a war or things like that, then you wouldn't have any need for courage. So you wouldn't be able to become a hero exemplar. Or wisdom exemplar. So this is where it's quite interesting with wisdom. She's so the work, Zebzetsky doesn't argue for this, but I use the work of Michael Brady, who's another person who he doesn't look at exemplarism, but he wrote a book called Suffering as Virtue, and he tries to argue that suffering gives us all these virtuous characteristics. And he argues that wisdom is one of the virtues that you get from suffering, because by going through, people who have suffered a lot more, they seem to be a lot more wiser than people who haven't. People who have had a very easy life and had a very, sort of living in the castle, they're going to be someone who doesn't have a lot of knowledge about how the world works like, more than people who have suffered a lot more. And so the key point he sort of argues, and it's a lot more robust than that, it's just the idea that suffering, again, provides us with the opportunities to be able to gain the knowledge to then be wise. And so anyways, what I'm then arguing is I put these things together and I say, well, suffering provides us with these opportunities to undergo these transformative experiences. Epistemically, my knowledge, and personally, my behavior is able to transform by me going through suffering or someone else. So then I can become an exemplar of morality. I can become the hero. I can become the saint, or I can become the wise person or something else. Now, someone might ask, though, well, why should I care about becoming an example? Or why should God care about that? Why is that important? Well, what I then argue is that God being good, would want to bring about the type of world where, so this is where then we go back to the principles. God, given the principles that we have, and given that God is maximally powerful and maximally good, he would want to bring about the type of reality which is an exemplarist reality and which is a transformative, a reality with transformative experiences. Because again, if there is the goodness principle which is operative, me becoming an example of reality is obviously showing a great amount of intrinsic goodness. I'm embodying goodness in myself by being an exemplar. So it'll be something that God will want there to be in our reality. Again, also, it's a way of spreading goodness around the world. Because I'm becoming an exemplar, I then diffuse my goodness by people admiring me and then wanting to emulate me. So then they would want to become exemplars of morality and all those sort of things. So you have this idea that diffuseness is working here as well. And then also we're having potentialities of, so I'm potentially a good person, but I'm not at the moment. And then when I see an exemplar, that actualizes my potentiality to be good. And then that becomes actualized by something else, and someone else's get actualized. And so you have plenitude operating here as well. So we should expect God to want to bring about this type of reality. And then when it comes to transformative experiences as well, we should want God for us to go through this, is because the value of me increases the more I transform in my knowledge and my personhood. If I become a more knowledgeable person, if I become a more let's say personally a greater person, I seem to have more intrinsic value in transformative experience. If I was someone who just always laid on my couch and did nothing and just watched TikTok videos or whatever, I seem to be someone of less goodness than someone who might have gone through a car crash or whatever and then survived it and then realized, oh my gosh, I need to, I can't waste my life. I need to spend doing, researching about the world and going about and doing all these things and helping people. And so I undergo a transformative experience, and I seem to be someone who seems to be more intrinsically valuable than someone who just sits on the couch and does nothing. And then also diffusing it as well. If I'm able to undergo this, I can recreate myself and enable other people to recreate themselves by going through transformative experiences. So we have this being expected here. If there is a God, we should expect him to want to bring about an exemplary reality with transformative experiences. But then also, last thing here as well, which is important, is that God could have made a decision where he said, I'm going to make morality something that I set for the world. So I'm going to put, let's say, 10 commandments, and it's going to go down on the ground, and everyone's going to read this 10 commandments or read it from the sky, and everyone's going to be able to believe this morality, and they're going to follow the rules. Or I'm going to implant it in their heads that they're going to follow the rules. Or there's going to, he's going to be the one who determines how we understand what's good in life, what's obligatory in life, and he's going to be the one who determines everything. But then the problem that we have with that is that then God doesn't really give us any role, any creative role within reality. Because God creates things physically. He brings about the world physically. But then he doesn't just do that. He also brings about everything experientially. So all of the morality that we have is then determined by God. And not just determined, it's also our knowledge of it is given to us by God. So there's no room for us to create things. But what if God will want, and I think a maximally good God, will want us to be participants in his creative reality, in his creative action. So that means that because we cannot create the world physically, that's only God who does that. He's a creator and sustainer of the universe and all reality. But one part that he can allow us to play is that we are the ones who allows morality to be discovered in the world. We are the ones who set what morality is in the world. That doesn't mean that we make up our morality, but we're the ones through our exemplary lives that allow people to then understand, well, that's what goodness is like. oh, that's what obligations are like, or that's what this is like. And so looking at these examples of morality, emulating them, that allows us to then have a creative role, because then we can play a role in making the world that God has into a good world. So God is the one that makes the world, but then we play a role in making the world a good world. And so the key point here is that this allows us to have some creative role, which a maximally good God would want to do as well. So we should expect God to bring about reality where we can be exemplars and we can undergo transformative experiences. But what I've argued already is that suffering is the thing that provides us with the opportunities to transform into exemplars. So if God created the world without suffering, then we wouldn't be able to undergo the transformative experiences to then become exemplars. We wouldn't be able to become heroes, to become saints, or to become wisdom exemplars. This can only be the case if we are in a world where there is suffering. And so that's sort of it, the theodicy laid out. But then the question is, what should we do with the other theories? Now, what I say is, my argument so far is that God and suffering are compatible, because God would want to bring about a reality that's an exemplary reality with transformative experiences. But in order for that to occur, there will need to be suffering in the world. So we should actually expect suffering. And this is turning on its head the problem of evil, because saying we should expect suffering in the world if there is a God, because of the greater good that it brings about, which is, again, the ability to transform into an example. But should we expect that type of reality if we take the other theories on board? So the way that I sort of analyze this for your audience would be with the work of Paul Draper, who's a very famous philosopher of religion, who sort of argued for the evidential problem of evil. And he used something called the hypothesis of indifference, where he said we shouldn't expect there to be suffering in the world if there is God, but with the hypothesis of indifference, where it's just the idea that there is no God, and the biological sort of organisms that we have and the laws that we have just determine how the world is like. And so suffering is something that we should expect. Well, what I do is saying, okay, let's say we take the hypothesis of indifference, and he doesn't really define what it is, but let's say we say the hypothesis of indifference is a catch-all theory for all of our other theories. So monistic substantialism, pure stuff theory, mereological bundle theory, extended simples theory, and priority-based structural realism. Should we expect these theories, each of these theories, to lead us to expect there to be a reality where there is suffering in the world? Well, I'm saying no. If there's just a universe, why should we expect there to be any suffering? If there's just stuff in the world, why should we expect there to be suffering? If there is relations in the world, why should we expect there to be suffering? If there are just qualities in the world that are fundamental, why should we expect there to be suffering? Why should they compose objects and then experience suffering? There's no good reason to expect suffering to be in the world at all. So, and we can't also argue for there being an exemplarist reality. We can't argue for these theories shouldn't lead us to there being exemplars in reality. It shouldn't lead us to there being transformative experiences in reality. So again, this is where theism wins out. Trope theoretic theism wins out, because we should expect there to be suffering, because it enables there to be transformative experiences that people can then become exemplars if there is a God. But with all the other theories, we shouldn't expect there to be suffering at all, let alone there be anything like an exemplar or a transformative experience. So theism, again, the key thing here for this last element of reality is it leads us to expect there to be this data, this feature of reality, but these other theories do not. But then someone might say, well, hold your horses. You've gone a little bit too far here. Because should we really expect the type of suffering that there is in the world? Should we expect the suffering that God put in the world to be in the way that it is? Now, I deal with two objections to this, because someone might say, okay, fair enough, I like this idea of opportunities being provided by suffering. But the first one, I call it the severity objection. Someone says, well, why should we have so much suffering? Why should we have the severity of suffering we have? Do we really need to have all the horrible things that go on just in order for people to become exemplars? Well, the way that I respond to this is by saying, yes, we should expect this. We should expect there to be severe suffering if there is a God, because the more the greater the severity of your suffering that someone goes through, the more the greater the depth of their exemplarity will be. So what I mean by that in two ways is, firstly, if I'm going through suffering, and I'm going through a severe amount of, if I'm going through some, like, let's say, light suffering, I've hurt my leg and it's not really good, but I'm being patient and I'm not getting angry at people and stuff like that, then I might be developing the specific virtue of let's say patience, and so then I might over time become a saint exemplar. But we would say that it seems to be that you have a greater hold of the virtue of patience if it's not just because my leg hurts. It's because my kid, for example, is going through a horrific illness, or I'm going through a horrific illness, or someone else is going through something really, really bad, and I'm being patient. I'm not cursing God, cursing the world, cursing all these things, but I'm being patient and hoping and being compassionate. And so the key thing here is the more severe the suffering I'm going through or someone else is going through, the greater grasp I have of the virtues that I'm acquiring. So the greater example that I would be over time than if I just go through a less severe amount of suffering. And then the second one is that the greater suffering that someone goes through, the more admiration that they're going to elicit in someone else. So if I'm going through a great amount of suffering, because let's say I'm going through cancer, and I'm still loving to people, and I'm still patient, I'm still kind, I'm all these sort of things, and so I'm exemplifying the virtue of all these things, and so I'm becoming a saint exemplar, or I am a saint exemplar, I would elicit a lot more admiration than someone who's just hurt their leg and they're showing these virtues. Because the amount of suffering I've gone through and I'm still being an exemplar, it seems to be that I'm going to elicit a great amount of admiration in people, so that they would then have greater motivating force to emulate me and spread goodness around the world by becoming an exemplar themselves. So the key point that you have here is, the more severe suffering in the world you have, the more I'm going to be, the greater exemplarity I'm going to have, and the greater motivating force you're going to have to be able to enable people to become exemplars as well. So that's why that sort of deals with the severity correction, that we should expect there to be a severe world, so this exemplarist system can work. But then the second one is a harder problem, which is the gratuitous objection. Now, the gratuitous objection is that some suffering seems to lack justification within the exemplarist theodicy. So let's say we take a child, for example. Someone might say, can a child become an example of morality? If a child's going through suffering, can they become an example of morality? Or an animal, and I'm going to focus on animals more because it's a harder problem. The problem of animal suffering is a lot harder than human suffering. Now, someone might say, okay, fair enough, humans are able to become exemplars. So God creates a world where humans can become exemplars. But then what about all the animals that are suffering in the world? They seem to be non-exemplars. That means that they cannot become exemplars. They are non-exemplary sufferers. That's what I call them. Many animals, people would say, or all animals, can't transform into exemplars. Well, some pushback someone could say is, well, let's say my dog is going through a lot of suffering, and my dog is still, my dog is going through a lot of suffering. What my dog does for me is that my dog provides me with the opportunity to become an exemplar. So the problem is here. So the problem is solved in a way, because someone who cannot themselves transform into an exemplar, they can provide other people with opportunities to become exemplars. So if my dog is suffering, my child is suffering, or whatever it is, and they can't themselves become exemplars, they can provide other people with the opportunities to become exemplars. I can go and save the child in a burning building and be a hero example, or I can go and be compassionate towards a child and be a saint example. Or someone going through mental issues as a child, I can help them and speak to them and give them wisdom and be a wisdom example. So the key point here is it provides other people with opportunities. Now, pushback and the problem, this is the spirit of Aquinas here, of that's one objection, but there'll be more objections that people can give, and so you need to give other answers. Now, the further objection someone can have is, okay, fair enough. Let's say there are some animals and there are some people, some children, or specifically, let's focus on animals, some animals that can provide me with opportunities. What about the unseen animals? So that means animals that are distant from human beings. So animals living in other unexplored parts of the world, and they're living, amongst themselves, and they're going through suffering. Or what about the prehistoric animals, the animals before humans were around? What about them? They will go through amounts of suffering. That's not to provide us with opportunities. So, this theodicy doesn't seem to explain their suffering. So that means that their suffering is gratuitous. Gratuitous just means pointless. So that means their suffering is pointless. But then, should we expect there to be pointless suffering in a world where there is this maximal power trope that we call God? We shouldn't expect there to be pointless suffering. You would want there to be suffering only if it brings about a greater good. So that's a problem. How can we make sense of the suffering of animals who are going through all of these things and they cannot transform into exemplars? And so these are the temporally, geographically distant animals. You can look at the book, and also I'm going to post this PowerPoint as well for people who are interested in academia. And you can look at the case of Bambi. That's a case that William Rowe gave just to sort of explicate this. Seems to be pointing to something he's going through. Now, in answering this question, I actually do something which is quite interesting. Because when I first wrote my paper on theology, I didn't deal with this problem very well. I wasn't very happy with it. But then in writing this book, I rethought through it and I did further, deeper research. And I actually discovered something that was quite interesting. And the proposed solution I put forward is that animals actually can be moral exemplars. And so that's quite radical. So people will be like, how can they be moral exemplars? Well, there is sort of a literature at the moment on animal ethics and the ontology of animals that tries to make sense of them as persons and moral subjects. And so the specific person I look at who's quite influential in the field is a guy called Mark Rowlands. And he has a book called Can Animals Be Moral? And then he has a second book that came out later called Can Animals Be Persons? And he argues that animals can actually be those two things. They can be persons and they can be moral subjects. So animals can be persons because they possess consciousness, they have cognition, they have self-awareness, they have other awareness. And so he goes through many, many cases I cannot do now, where he sort of shows all of the sort of evidential data that's been gathered about animals having these features of being conscious, having cognition, so rationality and things like that. And logical reasoning. They have self-awareness, they have other awareness, and he then said these are the criteria to be a person. And so animals can be persons, he argues, and I utilize this as well. And then he also argues in that other book that animals can be moral subjects. Something he says is that animals cannot be moral agents. So we are moral agents. So we are blameworthy for our moral actions. But animals can be moral subjects in the sense that they feel moral emotions towards others. So they can actually understand that, oh, this is not a good thing, or this is painful that someone's going through, and show compassion. So he gives some examples of, he gives an example of a real case of an elephant called Grace, where with her pack of elephants that she was living with, one of the other elephants got really ill and started to fall on the ground. And she will go and mourn the elephant's suffering and show sympathy towards the elephant and try and bring food for the elephant and try and help the elephant. And he was showing a lot of compassion, a lot of sympathy, which a lot of the time we would say we wouldn't think animals will show. And there was another case of like a dog that got hit by a car, and another dog who was not related to it ran and tried to help the dog by trying to bring it off the road and out so it could save its life and then bring it into the field. And again, this was showing, again, another morally laden emotion here. The idea of that you can actually show courage as a dog. You can show these things. So anyways, I use the work of Mark Rowlands, and I use the work of Anna Corsten, who argues that all of these animals, they can actually be classed as persons and moral subjects. And then Anna Corsten herself argues, because of these sort of features of being persons, being moral subjects, that you can actually class an animal as an exemplar. They can be exemplars of morality. They can actually be things which show what it is to be moral within their environment. So the argument I put forward is that animals in their own environment can be exemplars. Now, what I show, though, is because animals can express like virtues like courage, compassion, sympathy, they can be hero exemplars, they can be saint exemplars and things like that. But the key thing is that animals do not become exemplars, they are exemplars inherently. So because of their inherent nature, they are exemplars. And so because of the nature that they have, and again, I utilize various philosophical works on this to try and show this from animal ethics, the idea that animals have the moral laden emotions inherently, and so they don't gain their exemplarity like we do. I admire someone and then I want to emulate them and become like them. The argument here is that no, animals are inherently moral, and so why God will then, so the question is, well, why would God want to make animals exemplars? Because the key point here is that every part of reality has goodness within it. So if you think about where humans are residing, we're residing in a very small amount of the world. Even though we're spread, the amount of animals that exist in the world are so much more than humans, and also prior to our existence as well. But in those areas, there is goodness. So goodness is in all parts of the world. So animals are able to exemplify their goodness. they are able to show their inherent goodness by being courageous, by being compassionate, by being sympathetic. So you have examples there. And then in the human population, we also have people transforming to examples. And so goodness is able to be also spread in that area as well. So what we have is God, we should expect there's a God that he'll want goodness to be permeated. Remember, again, with the diffusionist principle, he wants goodness to permeate all of reality. And so that means then that we should find goodness in not just in the human population, but also in the animal kingdom as well. And given that animals can be exemplars, they can also show what it is to be good as well, being a saint exemplar, being a hero exemplar in their type of environment. So what I'm arguing for here then is there isn't any gratuitous suffering, because what we have here is that we have a way of showing that actually all animals that suffer, they have this ability to be able to be exemplars. And so there's a greater good that comes from their suffering, because suffering provides them with that opportunity again to be courageous, to be compassionate, to be sympathetic. And so that means that they can then express their inherent exemplarity, that if they didn't have that suffering, they wouldn't be able to express that inherent exemplarity. Okay, now the last thing then is, what if we get to a point where there isn't any, there are some animals that cannot, for whatever reason, they don't have an inherent exemplarity. There is a third option here, a third part of the theology, where it says that God is then going to provide a compensation to every single individual who's a non-exemplary sufferer. So that means if there is animals or children that cannot then transform if they're humans or express their inherent exemplarity, God is going to provide a form of compensation for them in the afterlife. Now, the question is, what is this compensation? I then use the work of Robin Collins to show that there are certain ACI connections that are developed between God and between every single existing thing within reality. So just very, very quickly, because we do need to wrap this up, but very quickly here, the idea here is that there are certain connections of appreciation, of contribution, and intimacy that ties everything that exists to God within reality. So the connection of intimacy is the idea that, and I utilize the word of Zagzebski here in showing that God is omnisubjective. Omnisubjective just means that God has total empathy with us, and so experiences all of our experiences. So every cognitive entity that exists within reality, God is experiencing their conscious states. And so God then is experiencing all of the, in some way, he's having empathy with all of the suffering of every single thing that exists. And so there's a connection of intimacy that's built between the sufferer and God. There's also connections of appreciation. There is gratitude that can be given because God is experiencing the suffering with that person or that entity or whatever it is, the animal. There's a gratitude that can be given because God is there with them. So if someone is deciding to suffer with me, I'm going to be very appreciative of that. So there's an appreciation connection. And then there's also a contribution connection. So the idea here is that there's a connection that will be built of actually my suffering has contributed to the ability for other people to become exemplars. So if there's an animal that cannot become an exemplar, but they can still provide an opportunity. So if there's one dog that cannot, for whatever psychological reason, cannot be an exemplar, their suffering will provide other dogs who can be exemplars to then to express their inherent exemplarity. And so there would be a contribution that they would be able to have a connection with that person or that being, because they provided them with the opportunity to express their goodness. Now, the key point is that all of these connections are built through the suffering of these individuals. And it's going to be made known to them in the afterlife that they have these connections. They have intimacy with God, and they're appreciative of the suffering that they've had with God. And they're also going to realize that God will make it known to them through your suffering. All these people were able to be good. All these entities were able to be good. So you'll have all of these valuable connections that are being built. And the key thing that Robin Collins says is that all of these valuable connections increase in value. So if you think about it, if someone suffered with me intimately, the value of my relationship seems to increase. The intimacy increases because of the suffering. If someone's been a prisoner of war with me and we leave and we're freed, it seems like the friendship I have with that person is a lot closer than if I just go down the pub with them every day. It's because they've had an intimate relationship with me, and so there's great value and it's increased. And same thing with appreciation. Our appreciation can increase for the more suffering that someone goes through and the contribution. So the key point here is he argues that there'll be an infinite increase of the value of these these ACI connections. And so in the afterlife, what God will have presented these people are these infinitely valuable connections that they've been able to establish with God. And so their time in the afterlife is going to be a lot greater. So this assumes, obviously, and I assume here, that animals will have an afterlife, that children will have an afterlife. And so the key point here is all these non-exemplary sufferers, they will be compensated by the great amount of value that they will have, the appreciation that they will have, the known contribution that they'll have, the connection that they have to that, and the intimacy that they have with God will be so great in the afterlife that will compensate for the suffering that they've gone through. So the end of this now is just stating that God is justified in allowing suffering if it provides opportunity for exemplar transformation, or it enables others to transform into exemplars, or and the sufferer will be compensated with ACI connections. So the key point here is that there is no gratuitous suffering in the world, because it either provides opportunities for someone to become an exemplar, or if your suffering provides an opportunity for someone else to become an exemplar, and the key point is you will then also be compensated for the role that you've fulfilled by enabling others to go through to become exemplars. You would have built up these ACI connections with God, and that will give you a compensation of infinite value in the afterlife. And so the key point here is that the suffering that we experience is something which is to be expected, because it allows us to become exemplars, it provides us with opportunities, and God is going to compensate us. So we should expect there to be this experiential element of reality if there is a God. But again, we shouldn't expect any of these things if there is the other theories. So in conclusion, after this very long talk, trying to distill 600 pages into this type of thing is very challenging. But the key point here is, at the end of the day, what we've seen is that trope theoretic theism accounts for all elements of reality: the physical elements of reality, the wave function and its collapse; the temporal elements of reality, four-dimensional block and exterior entities, so persisting entities; ontological elements of reality, which is four categories and essences; relational elements of reality, which are grounding relations, powerful qualities; personal elements of reality, which are persons, them being objects, and these persons and libertarian freedom; and now the experiential elements of reality, which is suffering. And so what we see is that theism provides a unified explanation of all of these things because of God's maximal goodness. And so theism is to be selected as the loveliest explanation of all aspects of reality. And so we now have a strong a posteriori reason to believe in God based upon metaphysical data. And I just want to emphasize again, all of these data are things which are, and for anyone I do again recommend you to read the book. Every single element of reality I've argued for, these are things which I take the top leading philosophers, their theories, and so it's not just sort of weird ideas I've brought forward to give evidence. These are the working main ideas in a lot of the areas of metaphysics. So I've looked through all the different areas of metaphysics and said all these 6 elements of reality, they are best explained by trope theoretic theism, and all the other ones cannot. And given stage 1, where we said that non-fundamental entities exist, and now we can identify this entity as God. God is the being who brings about all non-fundamental entities, and he's the one who explains all the elementary features of this non-fundamental reality. So God is a being who we can affirm to exist. Thank you, Suan.
Man, Joshua, I have so many comments, but I'll try to be brief and get to the audience questions. But one thing that impressed me about this presentation, Joshua, especially your book, is that I think some people might think, oh man, Joshua really, like you went overboard. But I think what you're doing is you're doing the important comprehensive analysis that needs to be done. And I think that, some people, for example, joke about how I can give 4-hour lectures on icon veneration, or when I did the Eliakim argument.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because that is actually the depth of these subjects.
Yeah.
We can kind of do the simple apologetic kind of argument and presentation, but what you're trying to do is you're giving us principles by which we adjudicate on various worldviews or metaphysical interpretations. You have the two tests, like all of this. I just really love seeing the precision and rigor of it all, and hence the subtitle for this stream, A Rigorous Case for God. And so I appreciate everything that you have done here. So let me just kind of get into a few of my questions, and then we will get into the audience Q&A. So, kind of going back a little bit, because you were going into the data and you mentioned the wave function collapse.
Yeah.
I think some people might think, like, let's say that we have a skeptic or an atheist listening to this stream. They might say like, oh, what, you got all of that from the wave function? These things about beauty, these things about goodness, so on and so forth. But that it seems to me that that's not what you're doing. You're not saying, let's begin with the wave function and, oh, see, like, it's good, it's beautiful. What you're doing is, as you said before, what with your explanation, like what kind of explanation you're pursuing, what makes it the case that we see these features in reality. And so you're pointing out, here's this feature of reality, here's this piece of data, the wave function, how it operates. And you're thinking about, okay, based on what we've already established with, or kind of adjudicating internally between the various series, getting into the external element, what view anticipates, let's say, that the wave function would act like this? Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, very good
direction.
So this is a good point to bring. So something that people need to understand as well is that there are two different types of explanation. You can do retrodictive explanation, you can do predictive explanation. So in science, in science you do both. So predictive explanation is where you don't already have the data, and you're then putting forward a theory, which then is going to say, we're going to discover this data at this time, and then let's say you discovered it. But then you also have retrodictive explanation. So, for example, evolutionary theory. The evolutionary data that people are putting forward is data that's already being possessed, but we're saying, what best fits with this? Like, why should we expect, if this theory is true, we should expect this thing to be around, okay? But we've already have it in our hand here, and what is the thing that allows us to think that actually this best leads us to expect this thing to also be here as well? Now, what I'm saying is that we all assume that or what I'm arguing is that we assume that there is a wave function. We assume that there is a four-dimensional reality. We assume these ontological categories, they're all here. But what will lead us to actually expect these things to be here? Well, God and his goodness should lead us to expect there to be these things because of the value that they have. God will want to bring about this type of reality. But with the other ones, why should I even expect this second thing to be here? There is this wave function. Well, if there's a universe or there's these simples, why should I expect this thing called a wave function? So it's just the idea of, what's the expectedness of these things? Well, if there is a God who has this maximal power, he can bring the wave function about at the drop of a hat. Why would he want to? Well, because of the great structural value it has. And so he'll want to bring something like this complex mechanism to bring about. And so the key thing here is it's not predicting, not saying if there is a God, we should discover that as a wave function. That's not saying that. It's saying we already say there's a wave function that's so structured and complex. Why should we expect that? Why should this be here? Well, because a God will want to bring this type of thing about because of the great value this type of thing has.
Yeah, that's very good. Okay, let me get to the audience questions. James asked, could you define, you mentioned kind of this phrase, appearance of reality. I think this was, maybe you know it better than I do. My mind goes to physics, and so I'm trying to reconcile your statements with general relativity.
So it's actually, it's not to do with general theory of relativity. So with the data, the first data was there appears to be non-fundamental entities within reality. And the reason why I put that word appear is because if I just said there are non-fundamental entities reality, then it is sort of begging the question against flat worldism, because flat worldism makes a commitment to say there are no fundamental entities, but there are appearances. And so what I'm doing is just to make sure that I'm not begging the question against that type of theory, saying, well, we all agree that it appears to be the case that there are non-fundamental entities. And so flat worldism does say, it appears to be the case, but it can't really explain why there are these appearances. So the key point is just, it's just a way to make sure that I'm not going to have an objection at the beginning saying, well, you just seem to be begging the question against some of the theories that don't posit non-fundamental entities. Well, we can all agree that there are appearances of non-fundamental entities. Well, what best explains that appearance of this type of thing?
And then James also asked, "What do you mean by fundamental entities? Platonic forms?" Question mark.
No, so I wouldn't say Platonic form. Well, the fundamental entities are just entities which are independent. So if I have a fundamental entity and I have, let's say, this sort of this ladder view, or this ladder view where at the bottom there's something holding everything up. The fundamental entity is not being held up by anything else. So it's the independent thing which holds up everything else, builds, grounds everything else within reality. And so that's what I mean by fundamental. Now, you might identify them as Platonic forms, but again, you'll have to run through the internal and external assessment to see if the Platonic forms are. Because what I was trying to do, I'm trying to identify what is the fundamental entity that we should affirm within reality. And through our internal and external assessment, it led me to God. But someone could argue for it being the Platonic forms, but you'll have to give forward an analysis for that type of thing.
Okay, and then we have a question here by Reflective Journey. What is a trope without the context of nominalism? What function or use does the concept of a trope do?
Yeah, so very good. So trope theory is normally utilized as a nominalist view. So when you're talking about nominalism, you're sort of speaking about properties. And do we take a realist view of properties as universals, or do we sort of say there is a nominalist view and we have other things which are not universals that play the role of universals? And so trope theory is sort of a type of a nominalist view in the idea that we're not positing universals generally. And then tropes normally fulfill the role of universals. Now, the key thing is trope theory doesn't actually entail nominalism. So a lot of trope theorists are nominalists, but you don't have to be. So, for example, E.J. Lowe, so Jonathan Lowe, who was a very famous philosopher, metaphysician, he believed in tropes, but he also believed in universals. So he was a realist when it came to universals, but he also believed that tropes were important in explaining certain other things within the categories. So he was a person who I took the 4 categories from. And within those 4 categories, you have tropes, which he calls modes. So anyways, the key thing here is you don't have to hold to nominalism because tropes can fulfill roles within a realist structure as well.
All right, and he also mentioned quantum mechanics, and so this is his second question. Bohm's, I think, interpretation of quantum mechanics has a global wave function, so that can fit well with Schaeffer's view of priority monism. Using loop quantum mechanics as a counter doesn't work. I'm also not an expert. Disclaimer.
Well,
Do you get the gist of what he's saying?
Yeah. So this is just the idea that there are different interpretations within quantum mechanics. So you have the Bohmian interpretation, you have the Copenhagen interpretation, you have the many worlds interpretation. So they're just different ways of trying to deal with the measurement problem. How do we make sense of the collapsing of the wave function? And so the Bohmian view is this idea that there's sort of a guiding wave that sort of guides. So why we find the wave function collapsing is not really that it's not really collapsing as such as being guided by this sort of these hidden variables. And so anyways, the key point is not to go into the depth of this. Someone might say that fits with Schaeffer's view, but should I expect those sort of things? So the key point is, remember with the evidential virtues, you have 3 types of virtues. You have evidential accuracy, which is the fit. Does it fit with the data? Okay, and that one's a very weak thing because many things can fit with the data. You can have a Bigfoot fitting. Let's say I have a footprint in the ground of a very big foot. That could be Bigfoot. Bigfoot fits with that data, but should I expect it to be him? So the key point is that you need to have also the causal mechanism. So what will be the causal mechanism within Schaeffer's theory itself to bring about the wave function collapsing? In trope theoretic theism, it is the maximal power of God guided by his goodness that brings the wave function to collapse. So we should expect that causal mechanism to bring about the wave function collapsing. But what is it by there being a fundamental universe that we should also believe that there is this wave function that collapses? So for me, I don't see the causal mechanism. So even if you find a theory that fits with it, why should Schaeffer's theory within itself lead to there being a collapsing of the wave function? So for me, I don't believe there is that causal mechanism. So it will fail on that specific evidential virtue.
All right, last audience question. Christian Prince Ears. Okay. Is there a way to explain the initial? This is kind of a little off topic, I think,
Yeah,
but
that's fine.
maybe really. Is there a way to explain the initial creation of the universe out of nothing? I understand that God is the sufficient metaphysical cause, but how did he bring something out of nothing into existence?
Yeah.
Yeah. What does it mean to say bringing into existence?
Yeah. Sorry. So can you hear me still? You just cut
Yeah.
off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, this question. Okay. So initial creation of the universe. Well, I don't know if we have definitely scientifically, we don't have an
Hmm.
understanding of the initial state of the universe. But if we're saying theologically, I wouldn't say that we know the exact way in which the creatio ex nihilo happened. But
Hmm.
what someone would say is, as long as it's not logically impossible, then it's something which is within the range of the power of God to bring about.
Hmm.
So even though I might not be able to tell you the exact way in which he brought it about, we can still say that, yes, this sort of thing fits with it because God is maximally powerful. He has no limitation outside of logic to his power. And so as long as it's not logically incoherent, this state of bringing something out of nothing, then we definitely have a way of making sense of this. But the mechanism of how this actually happened, I would say, is a question that if we ever experience a beatific vision, that
Yeah.
we could ask. Yeah.
Yeah, and let me just say too that sometimes when we talk about like creation out of nothing, this is always a problem in philosophy, like the way that we talk about nothing because it sounds like a thing when we say
Yes.
like out of, right? And that's kind of like the wrong image to have,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, yeah, because it's not like God, there was nothing and God kind of, I don't know, pulled like a rabbit out of a hat, right? So
Yeah.
to speak. That's not how that worked.
Yeah.
Well, Joshua, I think we'll have to end the episode here. I don't see
Yeah.
any more audience questions to begin with. And
Yeah.
somebody was saying, have you, and I directed them to your book,
Thank,
Analytic Theism
yeah.
with Rutledge.
Thank,
But they said, academic prices. So,
yeah.
Joshua, you said that on your academia page, that is academia.edu, they
Yeah.
can find papers. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So all of my papers that are published, they're all there now. They're all on my academia page. So whenever I publish, or I normally don't put pre-publication, but sometimes I do. But all my publications are there, so you can find stuff. And a lot of the stuff I argue for, they're in sort of a nucleus form in those papers. So
Hmm.
that will be sort of getting the gist of it. And then if you find it interesting, hopefully, hopefully you might be able to get the book. But I'm hoping that Routledge will decide to give a paperback.
Yeah.
And just if it sells well, then they probably will. But we'll see.
Well, Joshua, I appreciate you coming on to the show today.
Thank you. No, you're so gracious, and it's always lovely to come, and you have great content, Swan. And I'm praying for you with your studies as well, and I'm very grateful for you allowing me to come on. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Joshua. And with that, we will end the episode.